Live. It is Saturday here in North Carolina, and welcome to MythVision. Let's get our intro started and let's have some fun. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you're notified every time I commit heresy, and you can watch me burn at the stake. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest is Dr. Richard Carrier. Welcome back to MythVision, my friend.
Good to be here.
I'm always excited when you come back. You're just a great thinker, and you're all over the place. If I have a philosophy question, I can ask you. If I need to know how to bake my potatoes, I can ask you. You pretty much know a thing or two about everything. But I really wanted to have you on today to put you on the spot and allow everyone to be able to bring their questions, be critical, super chat your questions, ask away.
Yeah.
Obviously be polite, be respectful, but he's a critical scholar and he's debated many Christian, and you even had a debate with Dan Barker with a Muslim crowd. That was an interesting story you were telling me in California, how that went.
Yeah. I just also debated James Charlesworth on whether Josephus mentioned Jesus on Jacob Berman's show. So that will post in a few days or so, I expect.
Did he get, were you guys screaming at each other or?
It got weird, but not like that. No. There's a lot of really fallacious argumentation coming from him and a lot of patronizing. But other than that, it was all right. Like we each got to say our piece, and it was relatively short, like only about less than an hour. And we'd exhausted all points worth saying at that point. So it was so it's worth seeing at the very least, even if you'll be totally frustrated with the way he defends his position.
Interesting. Well, I want everybody to know they can go to the blog. Please do. It is in the description. You have, I've hired you to do an article on Israel only before. There's various articles. You can also be hired to do research for people.
Yeah.
So if you're like me and you're a layperson, you're interested in having a research project done, Dr. Carrier does that. I don't know if any other channel promotes that or even mentions that. I just do that because you have done one for me. If it's worth investigating, if you're asking,
and I'm expensive for that kind of job, but I've done a variety of projects like that actually, and so I do that. Do consults. I charge by the hour for video consults, and so various other things. I cobble together an income helping people in various ways. It's expensive, but that's the only downside for it. But other than that, I do it. For sure. And I also teach the online courses. So those are the more affordable ways to engage with me for a month on a particular topic. So for $49, you can basically have a month to plague me with all the questions you have about the subject of the class that you're taking. And then there'll be a bunch of, readings and challenge questions and things like that. And so that's the whole point of these online courses. And so I recommend them if people want to hone their philosophies, their knowledge and skills in philosophy or ancient history or Jesus studies, New Testament studies, things like that. So
awesome. Yeah, definitely do that. Also, he's got the books on Amazon, the latest, greatest. Are you working on a book real quick before we get started?
Not yet right now. I still haven't done the audio to this book that you're showing right now. And that's all my other books I've read. So they're all available on Audible. This one I'm way behind. I just can't find the time to do it. So I have to knock that out first before I actually start working on another book. I think my next books are going to be more like anthologies. But I haven't decided yet. So I've got a lot of like life things to resolve that are close to being tied up, and then I'll have time again to actually.
You're the only person on planet Earth that has that. No, I'm just kidding. We're all busy. I totally get it. I really do. Consider joining the Patreon, of course, MythVision. I have to give a shout out, shameless plug for my own work. I work very hard to edit videos. This is the latest and greatest, the Epic of Jesus. It's like a documentary style using kind of Dennis MacDonald's models and the ideas of Greek literary imitation and how that may have played into, and I say, I'm convinced that this is an absolute thing that is playing. The imitation is there. How much of it's mimetic, if we want to get technical on that term, that's a whole different question. But it's kind of a cool documentary that's like 29 minutes long, and everyone really enjoyed it so far. Paul and the Nations, this woman right here, her book, Cattell Barthelow's book, amazing interview going into the historical background on pagan Rome's influence on Jewish minds and thought, even though they called them Esau. How much influence did they really have? I swear, reading this literature by everyone, including Dr. Carrier, even if you disagree at the end of the day, because me and Carrier many things, like I can appreciate, I can value, I can respect, and it will, I don't know, it'll hone in your skills to be a better thinker.
And you give good interviews. I have to say, like, I recommend people watch the interviews you do, and you interview a wider range of scholars than most people do, and let them like explain their theories and their work and stuff. And it's really valuable. So I praise you for that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carrier. All right, now it's time to harass Dr. Carrier. I'm kidding. Thank you, everybody in the chat. Let me go ahead and give our first people who showed up. I'm giving out myth points. I am mimetically copying Pine Creek, except myth points. And you can catch them out at the gates of heaven. So right here, we have 1,000 myth points for Wonderfuller. Thank you, my friend. 500 for the Stevening. Make sure you're writing this stuff down because it's in my the Eternal Book of Life. If you guys ever like anger me, I might blot you out. But anyway, there's 500 for the Stevening. You have myth points. And Mr. Willis, I hope I'm saying that, Willis, hope I'm pronouncing that right. You have 250 Pine points, my friend. So first three people, I'm copying, mimetically copying. I'm telling you that I'm plagiarizing Pine Creek's channel here right now. And you three, thank you for showing up early. Welcome everybody in the chat. Dharma Defender said, Jesus never existed. Thank God. Oh, you guys are funny. Dennis, let's see. I'm just going to jump right into our first question and let's have some fun.
Yeah,
Thank you to everyone. I just wanted to say to everyone, Man, Bear, Pig, Baron, Canelo, Median, and on. I'll keep seeing people. Thank you, everybody who's showing up. Hit that like button so Satan can't win against us today. And Chris, thanks for the super chat. When will we get on the historicity of Moses?
That's already been done, right? Thomas Thompson's books are the real, or the equivalent of my On the Historicity of Jesus. It's now become mainstream, so you can get like Finkelstein and Silberman's book, The Bible Unearthed, which will go into the reasons why the mainstream scholars don't think Moses existed. So that's already been mainstreamed. So, and it's outside my direct field. So I wouldn't do Hebrew studies. I do Greco-Roman studies. So that's why Christianity is my orbit and Hellenistic Judaism is my orbit. But we're talking way before that. So it requires a different set of skills. And so other historians have knocked that out already. So I won't be doing a book on that subject myself.
Just a question. I don't know if you read D.M. Murdoch's Moses book, but I know that you disagree with her at the end of the day.
I haven't read her book.
Never read it?
No.
Okay. No comment then. No comment. Constellation Pegasus, thank you so much for the super chat, my friend. Always good to see you here. Are there verses missing at the end of the book of Jonah? Even the Jehovah's Witness comment on how the book abruptly ends.
Interesting question. I don't know. I haven't looked into this. So this is another example of Jonah is an intertestamental, or not intertestamental. It's one of the exile books. So it's a book that was composed under Persian influence. But it's like just on the cusp of where my expertise starts, but it's just before that. So I don't really do Jonah studies, and I haven't looked into this question in particular. If I were, I know what resources, what scholars to consult. So I would recommend looking at the New Interpreter's Bible Old Testament Survey, and you can get this as a single volume. If you can't afford it, go to your local library and interlibrary loan it. because they'll do that. They'll actually get the book from anywhere in the world, and it might take some weeks, but they'll get it for you. And then you can read the chapter on Jonah and see what the scholars say, because that particular volume is fairly up to date. I mean, it could probably be even more up to date. There's new stuff since, but fairly up to date and mainstream. So it gives you like, what is the scholarly perspective on this? And so if you want that answer, that's a good place to start. Another place to start would be the Hermeneia commentary on Jonah. The Hermeneia commentary series is the most scholarly and most mainstream. It has some apologetics in it, but it's more mainstream than any other Bible commentary you'll find. Has footnotes, that kind of thing, actually, and is concerned about the scholarly questions more than the exegetical questions, right? So it's more interested in the history about these books than how you preach them, right? So the Hermeneia commentary is the best series to get on this. So if you can find a copy of the Hermeneia commentary on Jonah, that's ideally the most recent version, because they do update them. That would be another place to look, or both.
Wow. Yeah, I must admit, the historicals, I used to be the exegetical, read all these commentaries on Ephesians and that when I was in Bible college.
Yeah. Most Bible commentaries, you go into the library and go, oh, Bible commentary, and you pull it out and you're like, what the hell is this?
It's a preaching type of...
Right, exactly. They're teaching, well, this is what we think it means for us now, and here's how you... And like, no, that's not what I want to know.
Yeah, and that's useful for some...
Stuff.
Right, I want the history, because that'll tell me origins or why, maybe more than anything. Thank you so much for that. Jason Anderson, thank you for the super sticker, my friend. Really appreciate that. Good to see everybody. Ape kill snake, and Gnostic informant, my buddy Neil. Little Impeller. Thank you for the super chat. Why do some think Jesus was modeled after Caesar?
Why do some? There's a variety of reasons. Some of it's crankery, tea leaves, right? Finding patterns in tea leaves. But there is so some of the examples. So I'll give you an example of a good attempt at this, which was, do I have it right here? No, I don't. I can't remember the exact title, but it's something et tu Caesar. So, or et tu Judas or something like that. But there's a scholar who's not an expert. He's an amateur, but he wrote an interesting analysis of how the gospel story kind of rewrites the Caesar story in play format, right? And so he's wrong. I don't think he's correct, but he at least had a balanced kind of view. And the general idea that you see with these kinds of things, there's another Price, not Robert Price, but there's R.G. Price does some books on this same topic too, that I think are fairly good. I don't always agree with him, but at least he's being more measured in this idea. And the idea is that the Gospels were written in reaction to the destruction of Rome, or destruction of Jerusalem by Rome, and are also reacting to the Roman Empire as a thing. So one of the values that you see definitely being represented, the techniques represented in the Gospels, is called transvaluation. This is something that Thomas Brody's talked about, and then Dennis MacDonald also borrowed it and uses it in his work too. But transvaluation is where you take a story and then you reverse aspects of it, because you want to sell the opposite message. And an example is the Emmaus narrative in Luke. Is a story. I don't know if you know this story, but it's like Jesus shows up after he's dead, and he shows up, meets the disciples, but they don't recognize him. He's like, they think he's just some old man hanging out with them or whatever. So he's in disguise, right? and there's this whole revelation that leads to their realizing that, oh, Jesus is risen, the gospel, etc. And you'll have eternal life, yada yada. So it's like, it is a gospel story, but it totally copies the Romulus story. So Romulus is the founder of Rome, right? So the Romulus story, the same thing happens, except it's a glorious appearance. Romulus appears on the road to the disciple in glorious visage and says, "You will have a great empire if you keep my commandments," etc. So it's the same kind of thing. However, the Roman story is about imperial powers, secular power, worldly power. That you will have worldly power if you follow my gospel, and it's associated with the aggrandizement, gloriousness, right? Whereas the Emmaus narrative is a humble narrative. Jesus shows up in disguise; he's not in glorious raiment, and the message is a spiritual kingdom, not it's anti-worldly, right? So it's the message. So they're borrowing the same story and they're changing these things specifically to tell you that they're selling a different message, that they're not promoting worldly empire. They're promoting the opposite of the worldly empire. And they're not promoting gloriousness, then glorification. They're promoting humility, right? So, and so this is how the message of the gospel is different from the message of Rome. And they use this story so that you recognize that they are changing the story, and the changes are what their point is. This is why they have different values. And so it makes sense to do the same thing with Julius Caesar, the purported founder of the Roman Empire, or to do it with Titus, who is the general who was primarily responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem, and became a later Caesar, right? So it was might have been a Caesar when Mark wrote, or certainly when Matthew did, right? So it would make sense. Like, it's plausible to think that they would transvalue the story of these guys into the story of Jesus to say that we are selling a different message than these guys are selling. So that makes sense. And I've seen some scholars do decent work attempting to extract that. I don't think it holds up in the long run, but I've also seen some serious crankery on this too. So you got to be really cautious about who you're reading, and where it's serious tea leaf reading, where they're just seeing things in the text that aren't there. So it's plausible. It's just, and that's the reason why it's plausible. But you need to use caution when you're looking at anyone trying to argue it.
Well put. Thank you. I was thinking of Adele Collins, or she has an interesting model there too, but not to get lost in that.
You're right, and that's she's a real scholar, right? Like actual degrees in the CV and publications. So under peer review. So that's a good example of Adele Collins is a good example of work to look at where this kind of thing is being done and done well.
Thank you. Constellation Pegasus, as a reference here, is the ending of Mark 16, 9 through 20 completely made up and not original?
Yeah. For people who are interested,
there's like 9 or 10 endings, aren't there?
Right. This is the book in which I have the complete chapter on this subject, like the most thorough treatment of this subject that exists, where I actually survey all the scholarship on this and all the arguments, pro and con, and show even the Pentecostals agree that it's not original. I often joke, and I probably on this show have joked about. There was an article that I used for this, which was published in there's a peer-reviewed Pentecostal sectarian journal where they do biblical studies, and some of the articles are decent. And there's one on this where it is actually a really good scholarly article, and it is so good, in fact, that they have to admit by the end of it, we've looked through everything, we've tried really hard to establish that this is authentic, but we have to admit that it is a forgery. It was added. Mark didn't write it. But then they tack on a paragraph that says, but the forgery was inspired by God, so it is still acceptable scripture. And so I was like, well, at least that's honest, right? I like that style of scholarship where they're doing real scholarship and they support their dogma with a faith statement, not with like trying to jank the evidence, right?
That's cool.
So I have more respect for that kind of apologetics because at least it's honest about like, oh yeah, we're doing the scholarship for real, but we're going to come up with a side reason to accept it anyway. All right.
Keep playing with snakes, everybody.
Right. But people who want to know the whole backstory on that, my book has that whole chapter in it. And my conclusion, I mean, apart from it being forgery, is that I suspect that it got moved over from a commentary. I think that this was someone we know there were some early commentaries on the Gospels, like Ariston supposedly wrote this commentary that we hear about, but we don't have any examples of. But if he were writing the commentary on the other Gospels and we're writing a commentary on Mark, he might have added and you notice Mark doesn't have the endings that the others do, but here's a summary, like a combined harmonization of those other endings. And so I think there was probably a commentary on Mark where that was done. And then someone said, oh, this looks like it would make a great ending to Mark. And they just took it from the commentary and plopped it into Mark, and it just became the new ending to Mark. I suspect that's what's happened because whoever wrote that long ending is actually harmonizing all the other 3 Gospels, Luke, Matthew, and John. They clearly know those other Gospels, and they are concerned about those Gospels and no others. So we're already talking about the specific sect that selected these 4 Gospels. So there's definite consciousness here that the Gospels, those 4 Gospels, have already been assembled, and then someone's commenting on Mark. And so it wasn't even in the original edition of the fourfold Gospel. It got added later, and the evidence suggests 3rd century or 4th century.
Thank you so much. Dharma Defender says, Dr. Carrier, and thank you, Dharma, I'm interested in more in-depth thoughts about Taoism. What are your thoughts about the philosophy of Tao Te Ching, Zhuangzi, etc.? Zhuangzi.
So you might know him as Chuang-Tzu, so there's Lao Tzu and Chuang-Tzu are the 2 in Wade Giles system. But anyway, different ways of spelling and pronouncing. But so there's those are the two leading famous philosophers who are at least attributed as the authors of some of the most prominent, like the core scriptures of Taoism. I used to be a Taoist, so people who don't know that, that was my only genuine faith belief. It was the only religion I genuinely had faith in, and I was converted by a religious experience and the whole thing. So there's a lot of like, and eventually came to realize that the religious experiences had scientific explanations, and moved on. But I tell that story in Sense and Goodness Without God, so people who want to know that. My background in Taoism, things like that. But I also have an article on my old blog, which is still up. You can find it on Blogspot. It's Richard Carrier, I don't remember, blogspot.com or something, but you can find it. But if you go looking there, you can find, I have an article on, I have a couple actually on Taoism, because someone asked me like about my favorite translations of the Tao Te Ching. And someone asked me like about how does it affect me philosophically. And I think I wrote an article about that too. So if people who want to get into that stuff, there's more stuff there in my old blog about it. I don't write about it very much anymore because it's just not in my interest area. But I have a lot of thoughts, so you'd have to be more specific in your question. So about what I would say about Taoism. I think it's a much so there's two different forms of Taoism. There's philosophical Taoism, and then there's traditional Taoism. Traditional Taoism is wackadoo. It is all about magic and sorcery and superstitions and things, and it's ridiculous. And that is the most practiced form of Taoism, unfortunately. Philosophical Taoism just takes the philosophy without all the sorcery and the supernatural, because there isn't really any of that in the scriptures. So there isn't any reason to have all of that add-on garbage, that weird stuff. So the same way that people treat Confucianism, right? Confucianism is the same way. You can just go to the Analects or the Lunheng or all these other famous Confucian texts and just read them as philosophy. And then Lunheng in particular by Wang Chung is very skeptical. It is an example of secular naturalism as a worldview in ancient China, right? So as a Han Dynasty author, totally disbelieves in the supernatural and so on, and gives like naturalistic explanations for things. So you could just read Confucianism like that. But of course, Confucius himself, or at least according to the five great classics, Confucius himself promoted the superstitions, not because they're true, but because they were necessary for the well-ordering of society. So for his ideas, like you should worship the spirits of your ancestors. There might not be any spirits of ancestors. Don't go into that. But it's important for the well-ordering of society that you do that. Like the rituals and the respect, the conceptual results of this are good for society. So Confucianism is pro-religion, but only as a functionalist, not as a supernaturalist. But the result is that Confucianism in practice has a ton of superstitions piled on top of it that aren't in the Confucian classics, right? So you got to be aware of what are you talking about when you're talking about Taoism or Confucianism.
Thank you so much. Doc Pleroma, good to see you here, my friend. Thank you for the super chat, my friend. You grew wings right before my eyes. By the way, Pine Creek was in the chat. It says, shame, shame, shame. What? Dude, I came up with the points first. Satan is tricking people here right now. I came up with the points, and then you took them, Doug. Why are you trying to act like I'm the one taking from you? You took from me. That's the shame here. Anyway,
I like Doc Pleroma Knot. That's a great name.
It is. Hey, he always comes up with some wild questions. Let me tell you, I enjoy him. Luke 24.
Do you want to see a movie about a Pleroma Knot that turns it into horror? It becomes a horror narrative. It's called The Black Mirror. Black Mirror? I think it's called Black Rainbow. Sorry, Black Rainbow, not Black Mirror. Black Mirror is the TV show. No, Black Rainbow is this obscure, pulpy sci-fi horror movie that is a emulation of an 80s movie. It's designed to look like it was a movie made in the 80s and a horror movie. And so it involves people kind of essentially going to the mystic realm and coming back wrong. And so if you want to see like Pleroma Knot as a horror story, that's Black Rainbow. It's a bizarre film, but interesting in that respect. Regarding the question, you can go ahead and
yeah, Luke 13-53 seems to parallel episodes from the Odyssey. How much do you see the correction of Cleopas, misunderstanding of Jesus' teachings as resembling Nestor and the theoxany of Athena?
I haven't looked into this. So obviously the place to look into it would be Dennis McDonald's book. I think he's got specifically a commentary on Luke. It's not titled a commentary, but it's basically where he looks at Luke looking for parallels like this. And if it's anywhere, if anyone's noticed it and has made an argument for it, it would be there. So I would recommend checking that out. I don't remember which of his books would be the best one to check on that, but he has one. I think it's on Luke Acts that's specifically in the title or the subtitle, and that would be the one to check, where he goes into these kinds of questions. He's coming out with a parallel. I don't know if I guess the parallels is going to be more about the Deuteronomy parallels rather than the Odyssey parallels, but he's coming out with one that'll be free eventually. It'll be online. It's a big PDF where he's going to try and collate everything into one place, and most of the focus is going to be on the Deuteronomy material. But I do think it does mention Homeric and similar material. So this might be in that as well, but it's not out yet. So his book on parallels between Homer and Luke, that is out. You can find that online or on Amazon or wherever.
Just so Doc knows, I did email him just now, literally as we were talking. So Dennis will get this, and I know him. He might end up calling me. That's just how he is. That's this kind of guy. Dennis, hey, my friend, how are you? And then he's like, hey, and then he starts to answer. So thank you for that, Doc. I did email him. Let's see what he has to say. Caleb Jackson, my favorite Christian, maybe my second favorite. Jonathan Sheffield and you are like my two go-to Christian guys I really love talking to. How would you respond to criticisms that parallelomania, such as between the Gospels and the Torah, Homer, etc., is unfalsifiable and poor methodology?
It's a good question because it comes up a lot, right? And you can find countless examples of ridiculous parallelomania. And so the question is there a valid way to do this? Or is it all just the same tea leaf reading? The answer is yes, because we've done it for ages and ages. It's called literary theory. We're doing it all the time and have been for decades and decades in every other field. People only freak out when it's suddenly Jesus we're talking about. But in every other field, religion, myth studies, literary studies, finding what's called mimesis, which is the emulation and transvaluation of prior texts, is so common and is actually a standard study field within history and literature and so on. We do it all the time, and so there are techniques for doing it correctly, and and what I would say by correctly is a method by which you can show that the parallel is more probable than not, and therefore not just something you're seeing. And there are techniques for this, and I discuss it in Proving History, my book on historical method. I have a whole section on how to do proper mimesis criticism and how to do it using a probability metric, right? So you need certain things that will increase the probability that the parallels you're saying are really there. And one of them is purpose, right? There has to be a demonstrable reason to have done this. Like it has to fit the context. And let's pick a trivial example that I mentioned on the Historicity of Jesus, which is West Side Story, right? So no one would say, oh, parallelomania, that's not Romeo and Juliet. That's just parallelomania. And it's like, no, it's obviously a riff. It is a rewrite of Romeo and Juliet. And they've changed some things. It's gangs in New York. It's Puerto Ricans now. It's knives and guns instead of swords. It's, there's a lot of things that have been changed. It's in song. It's a musical and not a straight play. So if you could go argue against it, well, it can't be Romeo and Juliet because it's a musical, and Romeo and Juliet wasn't a musical. It can't be Romeo and Juliet because they have guns and not swords, and there's no Puerto Ricans in Romeo and Juliet, etc. So you could act like that, but everybody would recognize that that's a dumb argument, right? It's obvious that they're borrowing all the core elements of Romeo and Juliet and rewriting it in a new way for a new message for a new audience, right? So that's an example of mimesis criticism that's valid, and it's obvious that there is a valid way to do that. But then you could see someone that would say, like, someone would try to find a movie and try to find a parallel, and it's like, I don't think the parallels you're seeing there are really there. Like, I don't think the author of the movie really knew what you're talking about. So you can find bad examples of it, but there are legitimate ones. And so if you want to see like a criteria-based probabilistic logic behind this, how you would do it formally and correctly, I have a whole section on that in Proving History, where I go into that, how we do that. And the way we do that is to go look at how it's been done before outside the context of where people freak out. Like instead of looking at Jesus studies, go look at, for instance, the example that I given on the Historicity of Jesus is how scholars have thoroughly demonstrated that the Aeneid of Virgil is a huge copy and rewrite of the Homeric epics, the Odyssey in particular, right? But it's not just the Odyssey. He borrows from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and he's rewriting scenes, and how you do that and how you show that that's being done. That's all plain, and that's mainstream studies of Virgil and Homeric studies. That's mainstream, right? There's nothing, no one freaks out about it being parallelomania. But there's a legitimate way to do it, and so you have to go look and see what techniques are being used in those other fields where it's really being done. And then you have to port those methods over, and you can't just go looking for anything that you can make with any leap of retrofitting. That's not valid. You do need to use some sort of discipline.
Awesome. Yeah, there's so much here. We got so many super chat questions. It's ridiculous. And so I want to thank you all, of course, for the support. I really appreciate that. Let me turn off my AC real quick because it makes noise.
Oh, I was going to say.
and then let me continue here. Here's our next one. If you want to start on it, you can. Thank you, Marcus.
You turned off your AC. I just turned off my heater. That tells you how different. Yeah, we're going to have snow up here coming in a few days.
Okay. Sorry. Hello, Mr. Carrier. We are all just wondering if you could tell us why you are so awesome and how did that occur? Derek, always love your stuff. Thank you for the super chat.
What is it? Nuts and berries. No. Proper diet. No. Honestly, just being what do I say? Healthily self-critical, right? Like rather than being like toxically self-critical, which people can be, rather than doing that, engaging in healthy self-criticism to try and improve my knowledge and not get stuck in ruts that other people get stuck in terms of assuming certain things are true. I always like to figure out like, how can I test my beliefs and improve them over time? And I've been doing this for a long time, right? So decades now. So, it's like, I'm a very different kind of person now than I was, 20 years ago. So it's taken a lot of work, but focusing on that. And that's true in philosophy. It's true in history, like and even in my knowledge of science and other things, is like, I'm really aiming at making sure that my information and my knowledge and understanding is correct, and always looking for opportunities to test it and fix it if it's wrong, right? So if insofar as the question's even meant to be sincere.
Yeah, you literally interpreted that. And so
that's what I would suggest. I would recommend to people.
He just found this message to mean something, and he just went, "Oh, I'm critical of myself." No, I really enjoy hanging out with you. Of course, we did that in California, and it was really cool. You hung out with Dennis. It was really, really cool watching you guys get drunk every night. That was
fun. Yeah, I loved it. Yeah.
No, but seriously, it was really fun learning so much from you guys. Festering Boils, thank you for the super chat, my friend. You do know everybody who super chats gets like direct access into heaven. 72 of whatever you want other than virgins. So just keep that in mind. Were Jews still being stoned as punishment for adultery in Jesus' time? And was Jesus upholding stoning laws in Matthew 5:18? Could the pericope adultery story have been added to oppose stoning?
Well, okay, it's two questions. The short answer is yes. So we still have that in the Mishnah and the Talmud are quite plain on this. Now, to what extent people got let off, right? That is a different question that you would have to ask someone like Jody Magnus or someone who's an expert in Second Temple Judaism, right? So there are experts who studied this stuff more, who could talk about how often it really happened. But it was on the books, and by all accounts, it was a thing that could happen to you, to be stoned for this. And so that's true. And yes, the Jesus in Matthew is totally like, even if it were the case that stoning weren't happening, the Jesus of Matthew wants it back. That is definitely what's going on in Matthew. Matthew's Jesus is saying essentially, you guys are slackers. Like you're not following the law by the letter, like the way God intended. Like you need to go back. and follow it even more strictly than Moses was being nice to you guys. Like, you need to be even stricter. So that's the thing. There are some aspects in Matthew where Jesus goes lighter than the conservatives, but most of Matthew's Jesus is very much like a Shammaiite, which is the conservative sect of Pharisees. It's very similar in many respects. Like I said, there's some aspects where he's more liberal than them, but not a lot. Whereas when you get to Mark and Luke, Jesus is much more like a Hillelite. So which is the liberal wing of the Pharisees. In fact, it's almost verbatim, like almost the exact same, like a Hillelite Pharisee would be siding with Jesus on almost every point made in the Gospels. So the Mark and Luke especially. So, and John even. So that's the basic background. Now, is the Pericope Adulterae, which is a story that got added to John. We don't know where it came from. It's actually in Luke in some manuscripts, so it floats around. So it's this story where a woman is taken in adultery. She's going to be stoned for the crime, and then the Pharisees, I think, or the Sanhedrin, asks him like something like, "Should we do this?" And he's like, "Well, let the first among you throw the first. Let the one with you, one among you without sin, throw the first stone." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Then maybe we should let her go." But the ending of it is that Jesus says, you are forgiven, but go and sin no more. Right. So Jesus is not saying, "Oh, go be an adulteress. That's great." So he's still saying, "Go and sin no more." So there's still an ominous threat of something there. Right. Like, so there's going to be some punishment for you. So is the story specifically against stoning? That could be. But I think by the time that story gets written, because it appears after we don't know when it's like early 2nd century, probably, because it doesn't appear earlier in the Gospels. So by the time that's a thing, it might not even be in a Jewish context anymore. So like stoning might not even be on the mind as a thing, right? Because there's a lot more law and order. So mind you, this is after the Jewish War. So after the Jewish War, the treaty with Judea was nullified. So the Jews lost the power to actually enforce their own laws.
Right.
Unless they had it specifically worked out municipality by municipality, right? So whether after the Jewish War, whether people were being stoned for adultery is a more open question that I haven't looked into. There would be reasons to suspect not, but you'd have to check to find out, because the basis for allowing you to just murder people based on your own arbitrary laws within the Roman Empire was the treaty. But the treaty is gone after 70, so that's a whole different story.
Or is this trying to fix that problem by showing forgiveness?
Yeah, I don't know. So it could be. I think the main gist of the story is forgiveness and waiting for the apocalypse should replace enforcement of the law. And this is actually in Matthew as well. So Matthew says the same thing. And for the individual, it doesn't necessarily say the courts should do this, but the way the Pericope Adulterae is going a little bit beyond Matthew and saying, well, even the courts should just let people go because God's going to burn them to hell in a couple of days. That kind of, that's the thinking. But in Matthew, he's saying individuals shouldn't even take people to court. Don't punish anyone. Like, no matter how big a sinner they are, no matter how much they abuse you, even if they enslave you, rob you, kill your family, it doesn't matter. Do nothing, because if you do something, you might slip up and sin. Whereas if you do nothing, God's going to come and melt everybody in a couple of years anyway, and you're going to live forever in heaven. So who cares if you're a slave between now and then? Right. Who cares if your family gets killed? It doesn't matter. They're all going to get raised and live in paradise. So it doesn't matter, right? So that's the Matthew's version. It's very apocalyptic. It's the idea that you should this is the whole turn the other cheek. It's not some like wise ethic. It's literally just don't risk sinning because it's almost over. Just got to hang on for a little bit. Suffer as much as possible. Let criminals kill and eat you even. It doesn't matter, because God's going to sort it out very soon. And so this is a very dark apocalyptic worldview. It's not a very uplifting one. By the time the Pericope Adulterae gets written, though, we're in a different context and things have changed. So it's harder to know what its original intent was, especially because it's out of context. Like, did it get taken out of another gospel that we don't have and got moved over? Don't know. Was it a part of one of the redactions of John? We know our version of John is a third redaction. So 2 other authors or groups of authors have gone over it, moved it around, taken things out, added things. So it's been edited multiple times. And this is a mainstream view. This isn't just some weird thing I'm saying. All the leading Johannine scholars agree that our John is a multiply redacted text. So, and we have like the Egerton Gospel, which has other weird stuff that overlaps with John, but has other weird stories in it. Is the Egerton Gospel one of the earlier redactions, and stuff got pulled out? So the Pericope Adulterae could have been in one of these earlier redactions and got pulled out of some copies and not others. Who knows? Like, it's too complicated to answer this question. And because we don't have the original context, it's harder to think in terms of what its original point was. But it is definitely selling Matthew's idea that forgiveness should replace punishment on earth, because celestial punishment is coming. And so I think that's the main gist of it. Now, is there a subtext of also like stoning is stupid? That's possible, but it's hard to know for sure.
Thank you so much. Doc Pleromanot's back again. Thank you, my friend, for the super chat. Jesus' pre-existence is neither articulated in the Synoptics nor in Acts, but wouldn't the "I have come" sayings be analogous to saying "made by heavenly visitors to earth"?
That's a good point. And the fact, right? So it can be interpreted both ways. I think it might even be deliberately vague. And here's the reason. So we know that Mark is composing his gospel based on the epistles of Paul and the theology of Paul. So Mark is very much reifying Paul's teachings into the gospel and into a gospel narrative. And for people who want to see the scholarship on this and examples, I have a blog article on how Mark uses the epistles of Paul. You can go to my website, richardcarrier.info, search for Mark and epistles of Paul, and read. And I have a bibliography of this is mainstream scholarship. I have a bibliography on it, and then I give many examples from the literature on this. So Mark is definitely using Paul, and Paul is definitely a pre-existent. His theology is definitely a pre-existent Jesus. A full-on angelic Jesus model, right? So the fact that that's not in Mark means that Mark is deliberately avoiding it, right? So it's not that he disagrees with it, because he doesn't argue against it. He just hides it completely. And so I think this is part of what Mark is doing when he says in Mark chapter 4 that to everyone outside, everything we told them in parables, but the truth will only be told to you in secret. And so Mark is doing the same thing. He's giving this straightforward historical narrative about this, abused prophet. But the underlying subtext that you're supposed to be taught in secret is this is all allegory for the celestial mission of God, right? So I think it's deliberately removed because he doesn't want it overt. And I think it creeps back in over time. By the time you get to John, it's all the way back into the preface, or at least our final redaction of John. Let's make it that, put it that way. So over time, it actually, the original secret teachings start to leak out into the text. And by the time you get to Matthew, you've already got the nativity where you're getting close to hinting at the same model, right? And so it's over. And by the time you get to John, it's outright pre-existence doctrine is right there in the preface. So I think that as a secret doctrine just starts to leak out into public doctrine over time. But it obviously was already doctrine, would have been accepted by Mark, even though he's not including it in his version of it. So I think that's how you got to look at the text in context.
Thank you so much. Flamio, thank you for the super chat. In Egypt, pharaohs are worshipped as gods. We have historical confirmation that pharaohs existed. How do atheists separate the divinity from pharaohs?
Well, rulers in general are regarded as divine in some sense, right? So not just in Egypt. Egypt isn't the only place. The Roman emperors
argue in the Bible, sons of God technically can be a divine title, even if it is a kingly figure in a way in antiquity.
Right. It's less so in the Old Testament than you'd find like the Roman emperors, where they actually were deified. They tended to be deified after death, however. So they would be quasi worshipped in life, but they would be properly gods after they died. And there's a famous joke that Vespasian, who's the emperor who defeated Judea in the Jewish War, and his son Titus is the one who actually was the main general, but Vespasian was busy conquering Rome at the same time, defeating Nero's forces and so on. But Vespasian has a famous line where, according to Suetonius, where he's dying, he's on his deathbed, and someone asks him, "How do you feel?" And he says, "I feel like I'm becoming a god." And he's joking because he's like, he means I'm going to die and they're going to deify me. I know it's coming, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of mocking the idea of deifying emperors, but it was common to do, right? So the question is, how do you separate divinity from that? And it depends. There's two different ways to ask that question. One is politically, what is deifying a a leader mean politically? Like it apart from supernaturally, like what does it mean politically? That's one analysis. Another is, how do you separate like the supernatural component from the natural? And that's what we do with everything, right? So we don't have a difficulty just discerning that, when the story is that Vespasian healed someone with a touch, that wasn't real supernatural healing. That was like a faith healing act that we know, like, psychosomatic or tall tale. So there's various ways that can come to be. So that's just the same way we analyze history in general, where we know the supernatural doesn't exist. So when it appears, there has to be some other explanation for how that story got told. And so that's what we look for. A different question altogether to ask is that we have the pharaoh, Osiris, who is a pre-existent deity who descends to earth, becomes incarnate, does all of these amazing things, gets killed by his own people, and then ascends to heaven in glorious power, and then controls the fates of the dead and so on. There is no Osiris. We have Egypt is one of the few empires of antiquity for which we have a continuous record, a reliable epigraphic continuous record of who was ruling when, and there's no Osiris. So we know Osiris didn't exist. We can confirm there's no historical Osiris, even though by the time of the Roman Empire, everybody is trying to place him in history as a specific pharaoh who actually existed, but he didn't. And so that's an example of how we can show that Osiris didn't exist, because we actually have a continuous record and can show it. Also, all the context of the stories told about him are ridiculous. So they can't even have a historical source. We do the same thing with Romulus. Romulus is a very suspicious name. It means, essentially little Rome. So baby Rome. And so like the guy who founds Rome just happens to be called baby Rome. Like we doubt these things. But the stories of Romulus only appear hundreds of years later. They hugely emulate Greek myths. So we have lots of reasons to doubt that Romulus ever existed as a person, but we don't have the continuous epigraphic record to verify it the way we do for Osiris.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Wayne Rossi, thank you for the super chat. If the crucifixion was derived from the Hebrew Bible, why do the Christian prophetic claims for it seem like eisegesis?
So there's different ways to answer this depending on what it is, what assumptions are being made here. So the word crucifixion, first of all, in Greek and Latin, doesn't mean what it means today. When we say crucifixion, we're thinking of cross-post execution. But the word back then was way more broad. It meant any hanging of the dead on a stick. Impalement was crucifixion. Killing someone, stoning them, and hanging them up on a tree is crucifixion. The word is the same for all of these different methods of execution and publicly humiliating the corpse. So in antiquity, there is no such distinction being made here. It's a much broader concept. And so when we get into the Mishnah, for example, where we talk about execution, there's 4 modes of execution in the Mishnah. You're set on fire, you're strangled, you're stoned to death, or you're beheaded. Regardless of which one is the thing, yeah, and they're graphically described in the specific procedure you should follow, and it's horrific. Yeah,
burn that guy. Yeah, he needs to be burned.
Yeah, and if you read like the description of how you legally publicly strangle someone to death, it is horrifying. But anyway, this is a brutal religion, right? So anyway, brutal teachings. But regardless, the corpse would always be nailed up on a wooden plank. And you could use any wooden plank. And there's a description of a particular way to do it in the Mishnah, but it's clear that you could do it wherever. So you can nail it on a tree, you can nail it on a stick, a vine prop, which is probably the way the Romans did it most commonly, because vine props were very common and you could easily get them. And so the nailing up of the corpse for public display is called a crucifixion. And that's just inherent in, by the time we get to the Roman Empire, it's inherent in Jewish execution law. So it's in the Mishnah, like plain up. So, and there's other basis for this too. I cite the scholarship on this on the Historicity of Jesus. In chapter 4, there's an early section on definitions. I talk about crucifixion, and I cite the scholars who actually point out what I just pointed out to you, is that the words are ambiguous. So when you get to Christian prophetic claims, now there's a difference between ancient Christians and modern Christians. Now, when you're talking about modern Christians, they just don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Right. So modern Christians are just repeating things that they've been told by modern scholars of their own ilk, meaning apologists and preachers and stuff. They don't know this. Everything I just explained to you, they don't know that because they don't actually check these things. So modern Christian apologists and exegetes and so on are often deeply ignorant of what actually the reality was in the ancient world, because they don't check. They check their own people's, what they've said, their own, they'll read, 19th century theologians and not realize that maybe those theologians don't know what they're talking about either. Maybe you should go check the original context, right? So that's why you get mainstream scholarship corrects all this stuff. So if you're actually paying attention to mainstream peer-reviewed scholarship, you'll be corrected on these things. So modern Christian eisegesis and exegesis is often deeply uninformed. So it's not usable for understanding the ancient world. Ancient Christians, what we're looking at is Pesher. And Pesher, we see this in the Qumran, the Dead Sea sect. Pesher is where you look at the Bible and you find these disparate passages in different books, different periods, originally by the intention of the authors, never connected to each other. And you see tea leaf patterns and you go, and then you come up with the story. You take them and you piece them together and you create a new story. And you say, this is a hidden story that God hid there. And the Holy Spirit is telling me that this is true. Now, this is completely bogus, but it's what they did, right? So, and then they come up with these like ridiculous prophecies based on doing this, right? Like cherry picking passages, creating a new story that's a list of these passages and saying that God told me that this is a secret prophecy that he hid in the Bible. And then, this is normal. This is what Jewish, especially fringe sects and apocalyptic sects and the sects most like Christianity were doing. So when we see the Christians doing it, already from Paul, you see Paul's doing it or referring to Christians doing it. By the time you see that, it's the same thing. This is a pesher. So someone has assembled the theology of Christianity by grabbing disparate verses and creating a new story. That's the secret story that God meant, and this Holy Spirit told you it's true. And that is Christianity. That's how Christianity got originated. So what you're seeing there is a lot of that stuff. They're deliberately trying to support the crucifixion because they need that for their particular narrative. And sometimes they pick passages that actually do refer to crucifixion, and sometimes they take passages that don't, and then claim that it refers to crucifixion because they want this particular gospel narrative, which is like 1 Corinthians 15. They want that narrative, so they look for every possible connection. And I discussed some of the examples of how they do this and how the connections are made in chapter 4, again, of On the Historicity of Jesus. I have some elements in there where I go into this. Element 18, for example, I go into that. But so it's both things happening at the same time, but it's all crazy religious Holy Spirit stuff. It's a tea leaf reading that they're doing, even in antiquity. But it was at the time a respected method that even other sects of Jews were doing. So
I'm fascinated with some of the really interesting cultural background stuff. As we move into this next super chat real quick, I just want to mention why I mentioned this book that I thought was so good by Cattell Berthelot, and why pagan Rome had influence on Jews. There was this problem. If a non-Jew was trying to convert and say this prayer, the God of our fathers from Deuteronomy, and rabbis were saying, no, they are not descendants of Abraham. They cannot say the God of our fathers. The New Testament sprinkles this whole thing like the God of our fathers, right? These ideas. And I'm like, what's going on? Then another rabbi comes on and goes, that rabbi doesn't know what he's talking about. And he said, has he not read the scripture? And in the scripture, this is how he interpreted it. You can see what's going on here. His name is Abraham, the father of many goyim. You see, now they're like, don't you see the scriptures predicted that these non-Israelite, non-descendants would join? It's just fascinating what they would do. So no,
this is everything. Like the way Daniel gets reinterpreted and the way everything gets reinterpreted. In Isaiah 52 and 53 got reinterpreted. It's in the Talmud where they interpret it, the Jews themselves, the Talmudic Jews, like the most traditionalist Orthodox Jews you could think of. They themselves saw that as a future prediction of a dying Messiah. Like they're explicit about this. And so even though originally it was a metaphor for Israel itself, right? So, or it's Cyrus. So it's either Cyrus or Israel. They get conflated in later interpretations. But yeah, when these prophecies need to be relevant again, they reinterpret them in crazy, weird ways. And even when they don't need to, they will do it.
Thank you so much for that super chat, Chris. I read The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. I did too. That was such amazing. Such a long book too. And now I'm interested in Christianity's role during the Dark Ages. Any book recommendations?
Well, so I keep getting asked about like Nixie's book and Freeman's book. I haven't read them. I've read the freak out reviews, the criticisms of pro-Christian authors about them. the critical reviews don't sound like they're being fair to the text, but I can't tell you for sure if they are or not. So I don't know if Nixie and Freeman have written good books on this or not. Maybe they have. I don't know. The criticisms of them are often misinformed, and they're based on apologetics rather than sound analysis of the Dark Ages. So I have a chapter on this in Christianity is Not Great, which is a volume edited by John Loftus. Has a lot of, actually, all of these Loftus anthologies have amazing articles, chapters by many experts on many subjects. I have, in the first 3 anthologies, that one included, I have 2 or 3 chapters in each. So in this one, I have a chapter on the Dark Ages where I specifically engage with the apologetics trying to deny the Dark Ages existed, or that they were dark. And I counter it all. And I counter it all and cite actual scholars in the mainstream literature who agree and who are aware of this apologetic is a bit extreme and needs to be counteracted. And so I quote some of these scholars saying, like, it's kind of silly to say that they didn't exist and they weren't terrible. They existed and they're really terrible. And so there's a lot of apologetic devices that will be used to try and deny it. So they will redefine what the word Dark Ages means into something it was never meant to indicate, and then prove that the ages weren't like that. And then say, oh, then there weren't any Dark Ages. It's like, well, you've just engaged in equivocation fallacy, right? So it's a straw man argument. So there's a lot, and then there's denying evidence or exaggerating evidence. And so there's a lot of ways that this apologetic happens. So if you want to see that concentrated into one place, my chapter in that book is the place to start. And then there are scholars I cite in there and quote in there. Those would be the guys that you would go, or women in some case, you would go and check for more. And those are real peer-reviewed scholarly works, not pop market works like Nixie and Freeman's books. Not to knock Nixie and Freeman, I just haven't read them, so I can't say whether they're good or bad.
Thank you so much, Cade Welly. Good to see you here. It's been a minute. I recently watched your debate with James Valiant. Did you know he was going to flip out like that? Is that the way he normally debates?
I've never seen him debate, so no, I didn't know that.
He's debated on my channel before, and no, I mean he gets excited, but he's never freaks out like
right. I think he's a bit of a crank, needless to say, and cranks tend to do that when the pushback is intolerable, right? So if their cognitive dissonance is being triggered too hard, flipping out is what they do. Like that's every crank does that. So globally speaking, I should not have been surprised, because if you start actually pushing back against a crank's illogical claims or factless claims, as the case may be, and you don't relent, and you don't agree with them in the end, and this conversation doesn't end early, they have only one recourse left, which is to leave or to flip out. And so James flipped out. So that's what happened.
Yeah, I wouldn't call him a crank, but then again, I've known him for a while personally and stuff, and I think he got way overexcited in that one, and it didn't look good. I'll put it that way. It didn't look good, but I'm friends with everybody. I've been interviewed by Tim O'Neill.
Yeah, right.
Tim O'Neill recently interviewed with me, right? And I'm good friends with him. He's like enemies with you guys. And I'm like, well, I'm really good friends with these guys.
That's fine.
And
yeah.
I'm friends with everybody, man. Don't put me against anyone. Don't you dare. I will rip your wings off. All right. So Farsight, thank you for the super chat. In Historicity of Jesus, IIRC, you talk about Inanna still being worshipped in a town Tyre Jesus visited. Could you talk a little bit about that? Thank you for the super chat, by the way.
Yeah, so Inanna is the Sumerian goddess, becomes Ishtar in later cultures, but her myth, which was tied to Tammuz, who's sometimes called Adonis. The word Adonis refers to many different religions, unfortunately, so it can be confusing as to which Adonis someone is talking about. But one of the Adonises is Tammuz, who is Inanna's consort, and so they both have resurrection stories about them that predate Christianity. And we know that particular religion that worshipped Inanna and Tammuz, Tamuzi. It's Inanna and Tamuzi. It then becomes Ishtar and Tammuz, etc. Anyway, the same gods, just slightly different cultural names as time goes on. They become fundamental Phoenician deities. So they end up being worshipped. They have temples to them and societies worshiping them wherever the Phoenicians had colonies, which is all over the Mediterranean. and most prominently Tyre. Tyre is like was one of the Phoenician strongholds. And so by the time it gets to Rome, that religion is still there. The temples and the cults and the sects and things are still happening at Tyre. Now, we don't have actual congregants writing about those things that we get to read. So if there was literature about what was going on at Tyre, what the beliefs were at Tyre at that time, it doesn't survive for us to know. So we can only kind of guess and reconstruct based on hints and things around. So we can't be specific, but we do know that Inanna cult was prominent at Tyre, still in the Roman Empire in that period. In the same way that Hercules Melkart was the god Melkart, which is related to the Marduk, and it goes way, way, way back. So you get Hercules. Wow. Hercules Melkart is also at Tyre as a prominent sect, and that's another dying and rising god who got translated into like Greco-Roman terms, and so he's basically Hercules, who is of this particular variety of Hercules. And this is how Romans and Greeks did this all the time. They would go like to Egypt and say, so they're like, oh, this god sounds like Hermes, so Thoth. This is Thoth Hermes, right? So, or Hermes Thoth, right? So it's the Thoth version of Hermes, and that's how they would interpret it. And so Melkart and Marduk and stuff their stories were most similar to Hercules' stories. So people say, "Oh, you're talking about Hercules. You have some new stories about Hercules, I hear. Okay, so we're going to call you Hercules of the Melkart variety, or Hercules of the Marduk variety, and so on." So that was still happening. So you have this syncretism going on all the time. To what extent that had transformed the non-occult in the Roman Empire, we don't know, because we don't have good sources on that specifically. But we hear more about Tammuz. We hear more about Adonis. Origen talks about the 3-day resurrection ceremonies that were still going on in Syria, for example, for Adonis, which in his case, he specifically identifies it as the Tammuz Adonis. So we know that was still going on all the way into the 3rd century. So it survived thousands of years.
Well, that's only by the hand of God. I'm just kidding. People act like if a religion lasts that long. I had a philosopher, or his name was something, Bixie Philosophy, something in my chat yesterday, trying to argue that like, what happened with Christianity? There's just no explanation. And I'm like, what do you mean? What are you trying to say? Like, I don't want to get lost in there. Deborah Grace, thank you so much for the super chat.
Awesome. 666. Excellent.
Just a gift for thoughtful skepticism. Grateful for it all. Thank you, sweetie. I'm grateful for her. She has a book called Crucifying the Messiah, or Crucifying the Bible. I apologize. Crucifying the Bible.
Oh, I didn't know this.
It's a really good book. Really, really good book. You should check it out. She's not like a scholar, but she's really an autodidact and like delved into things. And she had this controversial chapter. People were trying to hang her on a cross. I'm not kidding you, for the chapter.
Ironically,
she made a claim that David may have been a bisexual king. Now, according to the text,
that's actually not non-mainstream. That's actually been a mainstream argument.
I didn't know that at first. I had never heard of this. So then I do the right thing. I messaged Joel Baden, because I started catching hell for this as well. Joel Baden responded. The guy who wrote a whole book on King David. Okay, the JEDP documentary hypothesis scholar. This guy's a Hebrew Bible scholar. He said, the language is quite ambiguous, and I think there's definitely something going on there.
It's in the mainstream literature. There's a lot of scholars who've thought about this. It's like, and it is controversial. Like, how dare you suggest? And it's like, well, honestly, this is before. I mean, so this is the other thing. Is like the timeline of the Bible is not the timeline of the Bible, right? So like the Bible is written as if Moses came down from the mountain with the Levitical laws against homosexuality. Before,
when Moses,
before David, but it's the other way around. Yep. So if you notice, like it's one of the later royalties, one of the later kings, where they discover these lost books of Moses, and that's where Deuteronomy and stuff suddenly appears, right? So these books get written after the reign of David. So the stories of David are written before they start basically harping on the gays, right? So by the time they get to like being anti-gay, that's long after the stories about David have already started circulating. Whether David existed or not, it doesn't even matter, right? So because the stories existed long before this. So even the actual
Gilgamesh
chronology
may have been goes back. I'm not sure about that, but I've heard that.
Oh, right. Yes. No, that's also a mainstream discussion too about Enkidu. Is Gilgamesh and Enkidu homosexual narrative? And it sounds like it. Yeah. It's entirely possible. And because the ignominy didn't exist back then, right? That is a later perversion of human thinking, is to be against homosexuality and so violently against it. But yeah, that came later. Not so. So it's entirely possible that David could have been bisexual and no one cared, right? Because this is before people started giving a shit about that. Anyway, so yeah, there's nothing non-mainstream about that. That's actually in the field.
This, Deborah. Clip this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Joseph, pardon. Thank you for the super chat. What do you think of Catholic Eucharist miracles?
I haven't looked into this that much. I've read some of the literature. For example, Joe Nickel has some good literature on this. So there was the heyday of the 70s and 80s, which was the heyday of miracle debunking. Some of the best books. So you have James Randi, Joe Nickel, a lot of these authors. They kept writing books too, but back then was the heyday of it. And you can find a lot of literature about this from them. And Joe Nickel and James Randi were magicians, so they actually know how to trick and con people, so they can see through tricks and cons really well. And this is why it's often been recommended that if you're going to investigate the paranormal, you either need to be or have on your team a skilled magician, because you need a con artist to spot the cons, right? And so these guys are good at it, really good at it. Joe Nickel was also a private investigator, so he was like a legit actual investigator, so he can apply those skills as well. Anyway, so there's stuff on. So if you want to find the authors who've probably written the best stuff on this, it would be either Joe Nickel or James Randi or both. You can find their books, literature on this. And I've read them, and I've read like just, it's been a while since I've looked back at them, but I remember looking at them and like the historical evidence for them is weak, right? For them being genuine, right? And so I just don't go further into exploring them because they're not useful for me for any of the work that I do. But if you're interested in that subject, there are those guys who do that.
Wow. Thank you for that. Everybody watching, the 560 people, hit that like button if you don't mind. Share this with someone who's a con artist. Anyway, thank you so much for that. Smoke, I appreciate the super chat. Do we have actual autographs, originals of any ancient documents? If not, do we have any documents that are even close? Wow, that's a pretty generic question.
The lame answer is yes, we have thousands. But that means documents, as in like court records, tax receipts, and things like that. Letters. We have hundreds and hundreds of autographed letters. We might even have one signed by Cleopatra herself. This was recently reported in the news that we have. There's a letter that a scribe wrote, and then the signature for Cleopatra is written in a different hand than the rest of it. Which the only reason that would be is that she signed it herself. So that would be like the handwriting of Cleopatra herself. So yes, we have those kinds of things. But I think what they want to know is literary texts. So that's different. So like Sophocles or Herodotus or whatever. Do we have any autograph copies of this? We don't have any way to know. So, for instance, we have a fragment of the Kestoi by Julius Africanus. It's a little torn piece of papyrus, and it dates roughly to the time that he would have written it. Now, is that a copy or is that the autograph? We have no way of knowing, right? And also, there's a bigger problem, which is, what do you even mean by an autograph? Because these guys usually didn't actually do the writing, right? So they would have a scribe do the actual physical writing while they speak out the text. And they might usually, like the usual method of composition is you would compose on wax, right? Because it's erasable and correctable. And you would compose on wax, you would dictate from your wax tablet, your scribe would write it down, and then you would erase the wax and start over, right? And you might have tons of wax tablets for different sections or thing. So autograph, in terms of the author himself actually inscribing a draft, would normally have been done in wax, and we don't have any of those. We do have notes in wax. We actually have, so there's peat moss in England, where it's a Roman camp where we've recovered like military field notes on the wax tablet, where before they were able to erase it, it got lost in the bog or whatever. So we have some of that, but like literary texts, I don't think we have any wax tablet versions of literary texts. So it depends on what you mean by autograph, right? And it's different. Also, you could say like approved edition, right? So if the author is dictating and a scribe is writing, and that version goes out, and at sight the author looks at it and says, yes, I approve of that, and that would be an approved edition. But we don't know that either. So like that little fragment of the Kestoi of Africanus, is that an approved edition or is it a copy? We don't know, right? There's no way to tell. There's no indication of this. So it's impossible to know. But do we have manuscript fragments, at least, that are close to things? Well, the Africanus is a good example of this. We do. And we have, so for instance, Sands of Egypt, we've got, what is the earliest? We've got Homeric texts, I think, that obviously don't go back to Homer, but that I think that go back close to classical Athens. Manuscripts, I mean. But again, they're like fragmentary and things like that. And Homer, the text itself, goes back even further, and I had multiple authors over multiple centuries. So that never had an autographed copy because there was never such a thing for Homer. It's an evolved, probably was for centuries oral only, and then got written down later. But anyway, so answering the question is difficult to do. Usually, for a literary text, we don't have a manuscript until about 1,000 years after authorship, right? So in most cases, so if you're reading Suetonius or Tacitus or Josephus, the span of time between when the text would have been written and our earliest physical representation of the text is going to be roughly 1,000 years. That's pretty typical. But then we'll have references to it in other texts, which then have their own manuscript representations. And so you can get complicated in terms of your detective story. But you can show that it's highly probable that Josephus wrote when he claims to have written, because you can show that the propagation of evidence throughout the world is such a way that to have forged all of that would be virtually impossible, unless you're literally running a computer matrix and all of this is an illusion. But apart from that, it would be very nearly impossible to have forged all of ancient literature and every reference to Josephus in everyone, in every manuscript everywhere. It's that's why we don't really doubt these things. But sometimes the evidence is sketchy as to when someone wrote, and we don't have manuscripts near to it, so we can't reconstruct it. That does happen sometimes.
Thank you so much. Lou Core, thank you for the super chat. I didn't see a question. I really appreciate the support. Thank you so much. Grays 174, thank you for the super chat. Why do we know from Mark 4:10 that the whole gospel is a parable? It makes a clear delineation when Jesus is speaking in parables and when he's not. Now, before you answer this, I just want to say we got like 50 minutes before you have to go, and you've got a ton of super chats. Just keep that in mind. Okay.
I could probably stick around until 1. I think I have. Yeah.
Just letting you know. I mean, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So okay. So this it actually doesn't distinguish parables. He only mentions parables. That's different from saying, well, when I'm not talking in parables, I mean what I mean. I mean what I say. Like, he doesn't say that, right? He's only talking about parables. But the thing is that the parables are functionally and structurally identical to the gospel. So the entire gospel is an extended parable. So when Jesus is telling these stories, and then suddenly you notice that that's what Mark is doing, and he throws in this, and usually authors don't throw these things in. Like, why would they do this otherwise, right? Why have this story even here? Well, it's a clue. The author's cluing you in, and so that's the kind of the literary clue that we look for. The author's trying to tell you, when parables are being told, the literal version of it is not what you should be paying attention to. You need to know the secret, real meaning of it, which is a clue, right? So it would be a clue to indicate that the rest of the gospel is that way. And we can show that just the way Mark has constructed his stories too, like they're obvious parables. And the parable, the story of the withering of the fig tree, is a really good example of this. It's like, this story makes literally no sense. Even in its own context, it makes no sense. Even if you assume Jesus is supernaturally powerful, it makes no sense. The story is nonsensical. But when you look at the allegory, the actual secret meaning, which lines up exactly how Jesus interprets parables, it makes perfect sense. And it makes perfect sense in context. It explains the entire sandwiching of the fig tree story around the temple clearing story. It like opens up the entire text. So it's obvious that Mark is writing parables about Jesus. And so when he throws in this thing about Jesus telling you, when you see parables, this is a clue to the audience, I think. And other scholars have made this point too. Power of Parable by John Dominic Crossan. It's a really good book. I highly recommend it, where he says, like, that's what the Gospels are. They're just extended parables about Jesus. And then he extensively shows why and how that is. So I recommend that book. And I'm not even particularly a fan of John Dominic Crossan, but that book is actually pretty good. So that's how we know it. That's how we infer this conclusion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Mark, thank you for the super sticker. I really appreciate that. The support and the love. I really do. I appreciate it. I don't know how to pronounce your first name, and I'm just going to say Kumar because I don't want to mispronounce it. Thank you for the super chat. At least once in my lifetime, I want to see a proper debate between Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Bart Ehrman on the subject, did Jesus exist? Let me answer this one. Can I please answer this one? I think it's only fair that I answer this one. We know what you'll say. You're definitely down to do it, okay? But I don't think that Dr. Ehrman will ever debate you. And the reason, if I could say, from hearing it from the horse's mouth is that you have been rude or obnoxious in a way, so your reputation has followed you, that he's like, he doesn't deserve.
Yeah, he thinks I'm too mean. Yeah, which is why I think the suggestion should be that we should do a moderated written debate. So the moderator can make sure nothing offensive gets published, that Ehrman never has to deal with what he's afraid of, where it's only straightforward debate material. And then we do it with written debate, so he has plenty of time to like research it and think about the framing of his words. It's not going to get gamed by rhetoric. It's not going to be, there's no trickery involved. I think and I prefer written debates, incidentally, because I think because of that it eliminates gaming, it eliminates rhetoric, it eliminates the kinds of mistakes you can make simply because you're trying to think on the fly. And that's much more difficult. It's not indicative of the truth of anything, right? It's more to do with rhetoric and game playing than a written debate where you can actually carefully do it in scholarly fashion, and you have time to think about it and research and fact check and cite sources and so on. So I actually strongly support a written debate. So I would love to see a written debate, and if it was moderated, where we submit our submissions to a moderator who makes sure it meets whatever conditions Dr. Ehrman wants them to meet, so that he can't use that as an excuse, right? So you can't say down. Right. So you can't say
I will be talking to him, and maybe I can.
Right. Yeah. So you can't say that I'm going to be mean to him, therefore he shouldn't debate me, because the moderator will prevent that. I mean, I'm not going to do it anyway, but the moderator would give him assurance that it wouldn't happen, and then we have a proper scholarly debate. I would love to do that in written format, and it would be extremely useful, and would make a great book, incidentally, if it's profit that motivates him. So
I mean, it could be beneficial for both of you guys.
Yeah, I agree. I think to an extent he wants to avoid talking about me, and I think he's worried about the reputation, like his reputation being hit by daring to even acknowledge me, and so there's more of a saving face kind of attitude from him that might prevent him from doing that. It's more about honor and prestige rather than truth and scholarship. I get that vibe off him a lot, but nonetheless, I would love to see if he would do this written debate format with a moderator who moderates and moderates the text, so that there's something in between going on. Let's do it.
Sounds good to me. Thank you for that interesting question. Really good super chat. David Kalkara, hope I'm saying that correctly. Love your work, guys. Keep it up. Dr. Carrier, are you planning to further explore your values cascade concept? Would love to see it debated sometime.
Yeah. So this is obscure for people who might not know about this. So now we're in philosophy. So I have two tracks of research that I publish in, which one is contemporary philosophy and the other is ancient history. And with a weird side project in Hitler studies, that's a whole other thing that I got involved in by accident. But anyway, so with regard to philosophy, so the values cascade is a blog I did recently about how so the question would be, let's say you were to build an AI, like a sentient AI, a computer, and you were to ask it, rather than tell it what it's supposed to value, you were to ask it, what should you value? And so you tell it, well, find the answer to this. Like, is there something that's worth valuing? And if so, you can adopt that as your values. Like, what would it come up with? Would it be able to come up with anything? Is everything just subjective and arbitrary? And I find that the answer is no, it is not subjective. Well, it's not arbitrary. It ultimately has to be subjective because it has to come from you one way or another. But it's all about ways to objectively evaluate different possible worlds where you value different things and what is the overall outcome to you and so on. And so it's possible to get to you do have to give one desire. The computer has to start with a desire to know the answer to this question. That's it. And with that desire, you can construct an entire objective value system from there. Now, it's still a subjective value system in the sense that it depends on subjective interests and subjective feelings and so on, but it is objectively reconstructible. So the computer could actually say, yeah, it would be better for me to be that person than to be this other person. And so that's the argument that I made. And obviously this is a kind of a controversial thing to say. It's not completely unique. There are atheists who've taken similar positions throughout the history of philosophy, but have never framed it the way that I did. And so the question is, am I going to write more on this subject? I don't have any plans to. I'm way behind on comments because I've been dealing with a bunch of other things right now, including migrating my site to a new host, which was a nightmare, as it always is. So I've not been able to get at it. So there might be a bunch of comments in there that I'll post recently. I'll clear through the queue and reply to and so on. So there's probably going to be more in the comments there coming up in the coming weeks. So there will be, if you're saying like, am I going to further explore it? I will in the comments there, almost certainly. And already have a little bit. There's some in the comment section there already, but I'm going to do it more because I got to clear the queue. There's a bunch of comments waiting to get through moderation. Whether that will result in any further books or articles about it, I can't say right now. It's possible. I'm interested in exploring it further because I think it's fundamental and important for anyone's philosophy and worldview to have worked out things like this. So I think it's important, even though it is highly obscure to most folks who aren't familiar with this kind of argument in philosophy.
Thank you so much. Constellation Pegasus. I love you, man. Thank you. Dr. Carrier, what book is it that you showed about the ending of Mark? I couldn't see it clearly. Too fuzzy on the screen. I need to buy that book.
Yeah, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. That is literally the title, because there's chapters on every one of those subjects in this book.
That's on Audible too, right?
It is available on Audible. You might, depending on what you want to do with the chapter, you might want the print, because then you have the footnotes and the scholarship and things like that, and the Greek and things like that are spelled out in there. But yeah, that book contains all of my peer-reviewed journal articles and magazine articles published in history up to 2014. So it's a good, cheap way to get like all of that stuff, where to buy those individually from different journals is super expensive and ridiculous. But you can get it all in there. And then I have a bunch of other big research project stuff that I put in it, including the ending of Mark, which was a big project I did for Errancy Wiki. That was another example of a funded project. Someone paid me thousands of dollars to do that. And so I was, because I'm being paid handsomely, I took very good care in producing the content. So it was worth putting in a book. And so that's where you can find it.
Thank you so much. Grays 174, you're back. Thank you for the super chat. Approximately how many times have you read the Bible books? In what way do you read them, i.e. like a genuine sponge, or as part of your job to go through facts? This is boring. I'm just drudging through this one.
The entire Old Testament I have not read very many times. I think I've only done it once. I've only done it complete once, and only in English. The New Testament, however, I've read many different times in both languages. So now I haven't necessarily read the entire Greek New Testament cover to cover in Greek. I haven't sat down and done that. But I will read sections when they're relevant to what I'm doing. And so that's most of how I've read the Bible. And in English, I've read the New Testament multiple times from cover to cover. But when I get into the original language, then it's section by section, and then I reanalyze. So I've read sections of the New Testament, even in English, many, many, many more. Like I've lost count, hundreds of times more than I've read the entire New Testament in English. But yeah, I'm usually focusing on specific projects rather than just sitting down and rereading the text, which I find largely a waste of time.
The Mythic Life. This is Kristen Whitaker Hood. This is her YouTube name. Thank you, Kristen, for the super chat. How did the crisis of the Third Temple play into the eventual rise of Christianity?
Yeah, I think it was very crucial. Probably essential. Had that not happened, Christianity might not have become a dominant world religion. Maybe. So people who don't know what we're talking about, the crisis of the third century is, to put it bluntly, there was a 50-year-long civil war that ended in a fiduciary depression. So the fiduciary economy collapsed. So imagine the United States Civil War, which was 5 years long. Imagine it lasted 50 years. And then right at the end of it, you had the Great Depression. The U.S. would be fucked, right? Basically, it would have been catastrophic in ways we can barely imagine. And the Rome was kind of rebuilt-ish, but on a foundation of stern fascism. So it became incredibly more superstitious, incredibly more fascistic, because people became ridiculously desperate. And so there's an abandonment of empiricism and rationalism across the board. And then there was a definite quest to use religion to maintain order, basically to sort of establish the empire rather than on a basis of rational philosophy, but to establish it on a basis of imperial controlled religion. And there were attempts at this already during the Civil War, the 50-year Civil War. There were many, Aurelius Victor and various other, even Elagabalus right at the beginning of it, tried to do this. They tried to create a religion that would be the foundation of the entire, that they would run the whole empire out of. But these guys kept getting assassinated before they could implement their plans significantly. So their missions died. Constantine did it. And they each picked their own religion to do this with. Constantine picked Christianity, and he didn't get assassinated. So the fact that Constantine got to stay in power for 30 years and his sons got to take over power after him, that solidified the role of Christianity. Had he, like Victor and these others, been assassinated really quickly after they'd come up with the plan, Christianity might not have seeded itself. It might not have become an imperial religion, and then thus would have just remained a religion among many. It would not have become an imperial world religion. So Constantine not getting assassinated is also crucial to the history of Christianity. But the age of crisis too, I think, if the 3rd century had been an age of continued progress, it had been just like the 2nd century, only more, then we would not have had Christianity on the other side of it. Like Christianity would still be around. It would just be a sect, another religion among many floating around. And so it would not have become a dominant world religion. So I think the age of crisis set up two things. One is it set up the whole empire's populations move away from rationalism and towards supernaturalism. So Christianity now became a hot item. It was more attractive than it was before. And then the 3rd century's push towards fascism. The fascism is a solution to hold the empire together, which requires an imperial religion. And so, and it just by happenstance, Christianity was chosen. And I think there's some reasons you can argue as to why it was attractive at the time. Like Mithraism had been more attractive. But in the 50-year Civil War, all those guys got killed off, right? So like Mithraism, and also, if Mithraism is the religion of your armies and your armies are getting wiped out all constantly, you're generally not going to think that this religion is such a hot item. Your God's doing really poorly at helping you out, right? So you're going to look elsewhere. So I think Mithraism got killed off, essentially. It was still around. It was still a major thing in the 4th century, but its influence and attractiveness died out in the 3rd century for obvious practical reasons. And so Christianity was one of the most organized religions that had already a network of control spanning both halves of the empire, which was crucial at this point because Constantine needed the empire had been split. He needed to reunify the empire. And so he picked the religion that his enemies had been persecuting in order to basically subvert his support in the other side of the empire. So he actually did that on purpose. It was a good, smart political move to do this. So these kinds of the things, the sort of contingencies led to Christianity, but it could have been any other religion had the contingencies been different. But yeah, if the 3rd century had not played out the way it did, I don't think Christianity would have become a world religion the way it is.
Wow. Well put. Kristen, thank you for the super chat, sweetie. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much. The Mythic Life. Neophyte 1, Dr. Carrier, thank you for that super chat. If Jesus was a myth, what was the utility in placing him in Capernaum versus a place like Sepphoris and making him an exorcist? Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, there's actually a scriptural basis for Capernaum. There's scriptural reasoning here. That would be and for Galilee as well. Having the whole scene set in Galilee. It's also useful for the Homeric parallels because you need a sea to draw a lot of the Homeric sea parallels. So you need a big sea, and there's a big sea in Galilee, but there's scriptural basis for Galilee as well. And so that was and even Nazareth, Matthew says that Nazareth comes from scripture. We don't know what scripture he's talking about, but there was one evidently that they're drawing this from. Whereas Sepphoris is a recent city that couldn't have any scriptural basis. Like it didn't exist in the Bible, the Old Testament. So it wouldn't have scriptural relevance. to have that. So I think that's sort of the short answer. There could be other reasons. We don't really know, like what associations, if you pick Capernaum, what associations did people make about that when you're selling the text? And that has a lot more to do with local knowledge back then that we might not have access to. So we can't always answer these questions.
Thank you so much for that. David Chamberlain, thank you so much for the super chat, my friend. I really appreciate the support. And Dalai Lama in the house. You know, I saw a funny video. I think it was a Buddhist monk. Maybe it was the Dalai Lama on video, and there was a mosquito biting him. And he let the mosquito bite him like twice, and then like shoot it away. And the third time it came, he went, just slapped and crushed it. And then they go, "You just killed the mosquito." And he goes, "Listen, after strike 3, that's it." Like, even he had his limits about life and about killing something like a bug or whatever. I really appreciate that, Dalai Lama. Seriously. Caleb Jackson is back. Are you there, Carrier?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. You must be reading.
Yeah, I am.
Whoa, where did we go here? I think it automatically moved me down. Here you go. What are your thoughts on books like Testing Prayer, C. Brown, Harvard Press, Medical Miracles, J. Duffin, Oxford Press, etc., that attempt to medically document inexplicable cures post-prayer? Thank you, Caleb Jackson, for the super chat. I got to drop this because this covers most of the screen.
Yeah, this is pseudoscience. There have been actual proper scientific studies of miracles that have proven that they have no efficacious power. So I would say, rather than look at like pseudoscientific scientific crankery, look at actual peer-reviewed studies and then ask why these guys aren't producing them.
So the books he's mentioning,
straightforward science, yeah.
C. Harvard Press and Medical Miracles, J. Duffin, Oxford Press. You're saying those aren't peer-reviewed. You're saying those are.
Well, so they're not studies, right? So they're just arguments based on anecdotes, essentially. And then they discuss the studies, but of course they discuss them apologetically rather than actually looking at what the studies actually say. So if you go look at those, you'll see, you'll go look at what's actually in them. You'll see that what is being presented is not a scientific argument for a conclusion. It is kind of more of a personal editorial apologetic argument for a conclusion. But when you go to the actual peer-reviewed journals where actual studies are being done, like we're actually going to actually test prayer in an actual controlled environment, or using controls like proper scientific methodologies, the results don't come out. So these books don't have any of those things. They try to apologetically talk around them, but they don't actually do any actual real studies, or they don't actually refer to any actual peer-reviewed studies that prove prayer works. The results always turn out the opposite.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that, Caleb. David Chamberlain said, would you consider walking Derek through on the historicity of Jesus, Bayes' theorem, and see if he really comes out as a historicist?
I think we've done this.
Yeah, we have. Yeah. I mean, look, what you put in is what you get out. And we've even talked about this before as well. So, look, I don't know the mathematics behind Bayes' theorem and like knowing how to calculate these things, but I've literally read your book twice through and through, and there's so much rich information in the book. I recommend people read the book, even though I do lean that there was a guy. So, what do you want me to say? You know, I don't know what to say. So that doesn't mean I'm dogmatic. I don't pretend like mythicism doesn't make sense or it's not possible. I just think that more probable in my mind, because I'm factoring certain data that Carrier would take differently than me, that at the end of the day makes him think probably not a guy. If you put a gun to my head, I'd be whatever you want me to be, though. I can tell you that. So thank you, David, for the super chat. Grays 174, have you dropped the insane contrived cosmic sperm bank hypothesis yet? No disrespect. Laugh out loud.
No, it's not insane, actually. I found more precedents for it since the book came out. So I actually have this. It's in Jesus from Outer Space. So I actually mentioned there's actually more precedents for it than I even knew about when I did the thing on the Historicity of Jesus. There's actually a Talmudic basis for the angel of night, which actually collected sperm. So the story is this angel, the angel of night, would actually collect sperm from every man every night, fly it up to God and present it to God, the sperm itself, present it to God and say, will this be a righteous man or a villain? and God would declare which it'll be. And then the angel would go back down and reinstall the sperm so that it could proceed to produce something. So if this is the standard angelology in Judaism, like there's absolutely no reason why God couldn't say, let me hold on to that sperm. I'm going to do some great things with it. And that's exactly what happened in Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism has the basis of the sperm of Zoroaster ends up being stored permanently or stored for thousands of years in this particular lake. And then when the virgin goes into this lake, who's going to give birth to the final Messiah, she's impregnated by the sperm that's been banked in that lake. And so Persian Zoroastrianism already has this. And we know Persian Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism quite extensively. In fact, most of the things we take for granted as Jewish are actually Persian. Resurrection, apocalypticism, the devil is the enemy of God. All of these things come from a flaming hell. All of these things come from Persian Zoroastrianism. So, so the idea of sperm banking is just mainstream back then. There's nothing weird about it at all. And this is actually one of the main points I bring out in the first chapter of Jesus from Outer Space, is that the ancient world was weird compared to us. Like how they thought the world worked.
I was going to ask you, have you read this?
I have not, but I would recommend it because I think she's really good.
You're going to want to, then this goes right into the vein of like all sorts of fun stuff.
Yeah, she's a good scholar. I would highly, and really sharp. I recommend people. It's probably a good book. I wouldn't doubt it from what I've seen of her and read of her stuff otherwise. But no, if you're going to understand the ancient world, you have to understand how they saw the world, what was normal and what was weird to them isn't weird to us, or what's weird to us, it wasn't weird to them.
Right.
So if you're going to talk about what's weird or insane, quote unquote, you need to go back and in context. Was it insane back then? It was not, actually. So this is actually normal thinking back then.
Wow. So just for fun's sake and a quick answer, if, let's say, could you still see a possible historicity model using a cosmic bank hypothesis included?
Yeah, of course. It's entirely compatible with it. In fact, it's basically what is being said in Matthew and Luke. Right. Yeah. If you think about it, because both Matthew and Luke say that Jesus is of the seed of David, but he's not. They have these genealogies that explicitly say that he's not.
Right. Right.
So that means the angel had to bring the semen of David down and put it into Mary, because it's not coming from Joseph. Right. And it's not coming from Mary. There's no, contrary to Christian apologists, there's no genealogy of Mary in either of these gospels.
Right.
So, so the cosmic sperm bank hypothesis is being assumed by both Matthew and Luke. Their nativities assumes cosmic sperm banking, that God has taken semen directly from David, held onto it, and brought it down and put it into Mary, had the angel put it into Mary. Because that's the only way that they could say that he's actually of the seed of David. It's the only way the prophecy could be fulfilled and that the narratives could make sense.
I've never heard of it that way, but that's interesting.
So even on, and this is in Jesus from Outer Space, I talk about this. So even on historicity, and even Bart Ehrman admits this now, that as soon as Jesus died, or very, very shortly after, like as soon as they're formulating their new creed, they've already decided that Jesus is a pre-existent incarnated archangel. So even if Jesus existed, as Ehrman would tell you, like they came to this conclusion, probably after he died, probably maybe the night after he died, who knows? They came to this conclusion that he wasn't secretly this angel all along, which means that most of Jesus' mythicism, most of the Doherty model, actually fits historicity as well. Like you could actually port it over so that you could have, like the nativities do, like you say, well, then that means he had to have been, the seed of David had to have been put into his mother Mary, and they're now talking about a historical Mary, his actual mother, and then therefore that's how he's the descended from David, but also is a pre-existent archangel, because that obviously can't be a descendant of David. So how do you get to be both, which you need to have both because scripture says it has to be both? That's what they would do. So you could do this, could have done this for a historical Jesus as well as for a mythicist one. There's no, this fact alone does not allow you to distinguish the two.
Thank you so much. Constellation Pegasus, what other Jews like Jesus before and after him were running around Palestine getting themselves in trouble with the authorities? Well, we already know in the New Testament in Acts.
No, I think, Acts is just borrowing badly from Josephus. So it's really Josephus.
Right.
I have a section, there's 6 of these guys that I talk about from the mainstream literature. The scholarship is on this. And it's in Josephus. I think most of it's in the Antiquities. But in my book on the historicity of Jesus, I think like element 6, something like, I talk about the 6 other guys. John the Baptist is one of them, by the way. So he's a classic example of this sort of messianic figure who gets in trouble with the authorities and gets killed, right? The Egyptian is another one. The Samaritan is another one. Theudas is another one. And all of these guys you can show, they all have, in Josephus, they all have a Joshua narrative. So they're all like selling themselves, according to Josephus, they're all selling themselves as the new Joshua. So they're going to part the Jordan. They're going to magically topple the walls of Jerusalem. They're going to do these things that Joshua did. Now, Joshua is Jesus, by the way. It's the same name. It's the same word. So these guys are selling themselves as Jesus, and they're selling themselves as messiahs, which is Christ. So they're all selling themselves as Jesus Christ. And Josephus never uses those words. He doesn't say Joshua. Right. He doesn't say Messiah, but he describes Joshua and describes Messiah, right? So Josephus, I think Josephus intends his Jewish readers to get this, but his Gentiles to not get this. So his Jewish readers would get what he's talking about. Josephus already knows about tons of Jesus Christs who are getting themselves killed. And I even hypothesize that they might have been doing it deliberately, that they thought that getting themselves killed would bring on the end of the world. And if you want that narrative, I tell it in a kind of humorous talk, but fact-filled, but humorous talk on this. This is my Wichita talk, which is you're all going to die. How the Jews kept trying to predict the end of the world and accidentally created Christianity.
Yeah, we did a video on this, by the way, too.
Right. So that video's up. You can find it on YouTube somewhere, and where I lay this out. So, and you can create a historicity narrative here, where you can say that, well, Jesus then did historically exist. He was one of these guys. He just wasn't famous enough, like, to be in Josephus. Like, he was just, there might have been like 10 of these guys, and Josephus mentions 4 of them, right? Like, so he picks the most famous ones and forgets the others because they're not important. So Jesus could have historically existed and been one of these guys, deliberately trying to get himself killed to bring on the end of the world, and claiming to be the new Joshua, claiming to be the Messiah, and so on. Entirely possible. And I give it like decent odds, even in authenticity of Jesus. But I think in the end, the overall evidence suggests that Jesus is a fake version of this, is not a real version of this.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the super chat too. That's interesting. Kevin Murphy, is it possible he did exist, but much like the cult leaders today, where they adopted a biblical title, but he actually had a different name, but we know him as Jesus, and the Bible stories inspired him?
Yes, I explicitly say this in chapter 2 of On the Historicity of Jesus, when I describe what is the minimal historicity. So, like, what is the least we have to claim to base it, to make there be a historical Jesus? And one of the points I make is that he did not even need to be called Jesus when he was alive, because Jesus is a suspicious name. It means God's Messiah or God's Savior, right? So it is deeply suspicious that God's Savior would just happen to have been named God's Savior. It is a common name, so it is entirely possible he was accidentally named that. It's possible his being named that made him think that he was God's Savior. I don't know. But it is deeply suspicious. But that in and of itself does not argue that he didn't exist, because the name might have been assigned to him after the fact, in the same way that it could have been assigned to the Egyptian or the Samaritan and so on, because they're all representing themselves as Jesus Christ's, the new Joshua, the new Messiah.
Do you find it odd that they're not actually named? He names them the Samaritan, the Egyptian. Do you think that's odd?
Right. He can speak. Even Theudas is a fake name. So, like, he's conspicuously avoiding naming them, and he's specifically naming them offensive things. They're all foreigners, right? So Egyptian, Samaritan, these are not proper Jews. I think Josephus is consciously choosing that for a specific reason, that he wants to distance himself and Judaism and Jews from these guys. So he's doing that on purpose, right? So, and also he doesn't want to notify his Gentiles to the whole Jewish messianism. So he absolutely does not want to mention Jesus and Christ and have to explain these words, because the fact that these words exist and have those meanings in Judaism is a threat to Rome, right? So I think that he's consciously avoiding this stuff. I think that's true. And yes, it's entirely possible that Jesus was someone else. He went by some other name. And even the Bible says, like, he was named Emmanuel, which isn't a real name. But yeah, he could have had another name and then been assigned that name later, even after his death. So that doesn't help us much. Yeah. But yeah, I discuss it in On the Historicity of Jesus.
Kevin, thank you for that. Yeah.
I should correct something I said earlier. I had mentioned Capernaum was in Scripture, and that's not correct. Galilee is in Scripture, and Capernaum's association with the Sea of Galilee is crucial. So that I think that's how it gets picked up, is because Capernaum was an important city with respect to the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee was scripturally important and thematically important for the gospel authors. So that's how Capernaum gets in. Capernaum itself is not in the Old Testament.
Thank you.
I just want to make sure I corrected that. I said it misleadingly before.
It's all right. We almost have 666 viewers. At least we're past, we're trying to get, look, we just need 5 more people right now. 3 more people. I'm at 662 right now. Just come on. We need to hit the number. But seriously, hit the like button while you're in here. 3 more people. 1 more person and we're at 666. Hold on.
There's probably people running multiple streams now. Just
I gotta screenshot this if we can get it. Someone, before we get the next super chat, come on, pop in here.
Unfortunately, you can't tell someone who's not in here to come in here.
I know. Summon them.
But you have 600 people. Maybe they could get someone on. They could tell someone to get on their computer and log in.
Right. Well, okay, we dropped 4 or 5 people. All right. Either way, we're close.
Came close. Well, here we go. 616, which is the other.
That's exactly why I was inspired here. He is sending a Latin super chat here, and we have our Greek the people who are entering are the 666, but this is the Latin version. Thank you, Joel Pearson, for the super chat. Are there any qualified historicists arguing for a historical Jesus rather than assuming, who are actually historians rather than theologians?
I can't think of any. Even the ones who aren't theologians. The theologian means you're a practicing theologian. So like Bart Ehrman, for example, is not a practicing theologian. But all his education, he has no history degrees. Like all his education is in ministry or theology or related subjects. So usually the people who are promoting or ardently defending historicity rather than dismissively defending historicity, the ones who actually like stand up and say it's ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't exist, all of those scholars typically have theology degrees. Sometimes I'm trying to think if any of them have a proper New Testament studies degree. I can't think of any. There might be one, Goodacre perhaps, who would be an example. But even he's not ardently arguing for historicity. No,
he's not.
Right. So New Testament studies is a degree that at least straddles the line between theology and history, because it's a interdisciplinary studies degree. So it's literature, history, theology, etc. So it's close to being a proper history degree. Although it's typically taught under religious studies departments, not history departments, if that matters. And so even that is, pushing it. But if you're talking about people who actually got a degree under a history department, in a history, it says history on their diploma. I can't think of any who are these ardent defenders of historicity.
Huh. Thank you, Joel. Appreciate that, man. We know who the real beast is, so you appreciate the code. Bill Castle, thank you for the super sticker. I appreciate you, Bill. Thank you for the support. I still see some names in here. We're probably way behind on these super chats. We're
not going to get to them all. Yeah, we're almost out of our 2-hour time. So
I know. Could Joseph of Arimathea have written the Gospels?
Unlikely. I don't even think he existed. So,
okay, thank you so much.
And frankly, if he had, he would say so. This is the thing. Like, if you were an eyewitness and you were telling your story in antiquity, that would be priceless information. You would not leave it out. You would actually say that was the case.
Okay, so just so everybody knows, if you're super chatting from here on out, it's because you're showing love. I'm going to try and push it through. Can we go a little past? I'll pay you a little extra for your time if you don't mind.
Okay.
If you're okay, because I know, listen, I pay scholars for their time on MythVision. Everybody's wondering. So everybody who's super chatting, you're literally helping me to make these shows possible. I'm not kidding.
I agree. My only limitation is that I've got another show I have to do later, and I got to do other things in between now and then. But I can hang out for a little bit longer. Let's do it.
Okay.
Let's see what we can do.
I got you. I'll hook you up with a good tip. Jay Victor, thank you so much for the super chat. Judaism is a national identity as much as a religion. Why would Paul turn to Gentiles to fill the ranks of Judaism 2.0?
Well, Jews already were. So it was actually, it's become less popular for Jews to evangelize, especially after all the pogroms and Holocaust and all this stuff. People don't like it. So Judaism as a whole has dialed back on its evangelism. But before the Jewish War, Jewish evangelism was a big thing. In fact, it was part of the Old Testament scripture taught that all the Gentiles would come to Jerusalem and worship the Jewish God. So there were a lot of, like, especially hardcore Orthodox Jews who believed that all the Gentiles would eventually convert. And so they thought they were doing God's will by converting people to Judaism. So there was actually a big movement to do this. And there was a lot of popularity. Judaism was really popular among Gentiles. Most Gentiles who found it popular didn't convert because it was arduous to do so. The dietary laws were odious or onerous, and the circumcision was a definite turnoff. So they would be God-fearers. They would be like, they would worship Yahweh, and they would associate with Jews and follow as much of Judaism as they were willing to, but they were not proper Jews. But some of them would go all the way to convert and would become converted Jews. And this is established. We have examples in tons of the literature. I talk about it in the IO Israel only article that I go into. So this was a thing back then. It was already a thing. People were already doing it. In fact, the original apostles before Paul were probably already accepting Gentiles in, as long as they converted to Judaism. They had to circumcise, they had to follow the Torah and everything. So the only innovation that Paul made was he said, well, because Jesus' sacrifice atones for all sins, and this is a new covenant, this is a new agreement that's been made with God now, Gentiles don't need to convert to Judaism. They can jump right into the new covenant. They don't have to jump into the old covenant, then into the new covenant. So his innovation was saying that Gentiles could become Christians without converting to Judaism. And this is the innovation. This is the thing that it was a little bit of a difficult sell. He had to persuade the original apostles to accept it. And according to Galatians, he did. He succeeded at this. I suspect there's some cash value involved in this, but that's a whole other speculation based on what we see in the subtext. But this innovation was very successful, right? So you've got all these God-fearers, tons of these God-fearers who are these Gentiles who want to be Jewish, but they don't want to convert because it's arduous. And this guy comes along and says, hey, you can be a Jew without all that arduous stuff. You can actually do the thing that you've been wanting to do all this time. So Paul had this huge market already tailor-made for him, where there's people who already want to do this, and he's coming in offering them an easier product, an easier way to get in. And so he's going to suck these people in. So he's probably packing churches everywhere with new converts at a much faster rate than the original apostles are. And so they were stuck with three options, really. They could oppose this and have their little smaller sect now be at war with this growing larger sect, or they could accept this and say, like, okay, we'll grant this, and then we'll try to control it. Right. So, and now when you think of, like, this is a lot of members, you're getting a lot of influence, you're getting a lot of money, right? So the option to be at war with this innovation is unattractive, whereas the option to, like, try and play with it somehow is very attractive. So there's hardly any reason to need to explain why they would be on board with this. They'd be hesitant for obvious reasons, but when they think it through strategically, like this, we should back this. Now that sealed their fate, right? So the original Jewish Christianity died out; it got crushed, Darwinian style, by the massive, overwhelming influx of Gentiles. So that the Jewish sect version became increasingly hostile to the Gentile sect, and then just dwindled and shrank. And so the original sect of Christianity, the original Christianity died out. There's not a single form of it left in the world that I know of, unless you count Islam, which is a whole other. It actually might be a remnant, an evolved remnant of the original Torah observant sect, but that's a whole other.
That'd be a can of worms. Scott Turf, thank you for the super chat. What do you think about the idea that Brothers of the Lord was a very specific group, as Robert Price says, and not just random Christians?
It's possible, and I've considered it. It unfortunately has a low epistemic probability because it requires more epicycles. You have to invent more back explanation for why it would be the case, and you have no evidence for those back explanations. So you're complexifying the theory. You're making the theory more complicated without backfilling it with evidence. And so what that does is it reduces the probability of your position. So this is the biggest problem with trying to sell a speculation as a fact. The more elaborate your speculation, the less probable it starts. And that's why you need evidence for it. And if you don't have any evidence for it, then it just stays improbable, and there's nothing you can do about it. Whereas, for example, Brothers of the Lord is all baptized Christians is in the text of Paul. Like, it's there. Like, Paul outright says all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. So we have the evidence for that. That's not a speculation. So we don't need to add more and more epicycles to explain the terminology. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it does mean it's not the most probable explanation of the evidence. And another point that I've made, I've pointed this out somewhere in my literature, I can't remember, but if it were the case that Brothers of the Lord was a specific group, then that means there had to have been some sort of naming policing. Because when Paul says that all Christians are brothers of the Lord, if it's a narrow sect, you're only allowed to call them be called brothers of the Lord. Then that means all other baptized Christians who are brothers of the Lord, someone has to police the terminology and say, you can't call yourself a brother of the Lord, even though I just said you're a brother of the Lord, right? So there it would have to be this complex policing of how words get used, and we have no evidence of that happening in Paul. So that's that's actually evidence against the price theory. So I don't think the price theory holds up. But it is logically possible. Like it's coherent in this in context, but unfortunately, it just doesn't have a high epistemic probability.
Thank you for that, Scott. Joseph Rotoni. I hope I'm saying that right. I apologize if I butchered it. I hear you use probability often. I think you can help with this. I'm atheist-ish, but I've struggled with this. If there is a multiverse or an infinite universe, would gods have evolved?
Yes. And I actually have a whole article on this. It's called The God Impossible. So you can go on my blog, richardcarrier.info, type in The God Impossible, and it's an entire article about how multiverse theory entails somewhere in the multiverse there are going to be gods if you broaden your definition of gods enough. Most Christians will not broaden their definition of gods enough to allow this. So most Christians will not allow a naturalistically evolved God to be a god. They find that offensive to suggest that would be a god. It's just a super powerful alien. It's like, yeah, I know. It's the same thing, right? Yeah. So if you want to know like how rare this would be or like what the significance of this is and so on, my article, The God Impossible, goes into all the angles on that. Now, the alternate question is it possible for a supernatural God to evolve? And no, I would say that if naturalism is true, then the probability of any god in any multiverse is zero, like actually zero, not close to zero, but actually zero. The epistemic probability can't be zero because we don't know for sure with absolute certainty that naturalism is true. But we know it to a very high probability. So we can say that supernatural gods in the multiverse are extremely improbable. The epistemic probability is extremely low that there would be supernatural gods, no matter how infinite the multiverse is. But natural gods, like actual mechanistic, naturalistic gods, super powerful aliens, as one would say. That's probably inevitable, super, super rare, but inevitable in the whole multiverse.
Thank you so much. Makes you think different about people being probed by aliens. Nick Sklavos, thank you so much for that super chat. Marcion travels out to talk to other Christians. He is surprised and eliminated. Who are his eliminators? Why they have so much different path?
Strangely phrased. Marcion was preaching for decades and actually had persuaded many Christian churches to adopt his sectarian view. So if you're talking about like who was opposed to him, it would be all the other sects who didn't like him muscling in on their territory and also didn't like his theology. They thought his theology was problematic. So now the specifics of why that is hard to discern because we don't have any of the discussion from his lifetime. So we don't have his enemies when he's alive talking about him. We don't have him responding to them. We have nothing. All we have is decades after he's dead. And I can't remember if we even have an account of how he died, but decades after, we have extreme dishonest polemicists like Tertullian. Tertullian's a fucking liar. Like you can't trust anything Tertullian says. So when he's talking about Marcionism, and most modern scholarship about Marcionism is just believing what Tertullian says, for example.
Right.
I don't think that is not sound. Like you should.
David Litwa says the same thing.
Yeah, you should not trust Tertullian, and you shouldn't trust any of these guys. Hippolytus, all of these polemicists against Marcion are just documented liars. Like you can't count on what they're saying. They're polemicists, right? So they're going to straw man. They're going to make up shit. They're going to, So there's a lot of things that you can't really get at what Marcion really taught. Or what the arguments really were in his day for and against his movement. But we can maybe guess at what the vague, rough outlines might have been by trying to look at the polemics. Like, why are they so terrified of Martianism? Why do they have to lie? Why do they have to, like, so you have to kind of like read the subtext, and so you can get like maybe some hints, but that's not a terribly reliable way to ascertain what the real reason was. But the short answer is, the best we can tell is that his theology was unpopular and his influence was unpopular. They saw him as someone who's muscling in on their territory, trying to take over their racket, and certain groups united against him, basically. So they saw more in common with each other than they did with him and his movement, and as politically happens all the time.
Thank you so much, Nick. I appreciate that. Marcus, Daniel Ponce asked, I think that might have been someone in the chat, what or where does the word Arimathea refer to the name of Joseph of Arimathea? Could it be a play on the name Joseph Bar Matthias inserted into the gospel narrative? And I think this is the idea that it's like Josephus or something.
Yeah, if that were the case, that's what it would say, and it doesn't. Right. So if it's supposed to be Bar Matthias, the Greek would say Bar Matthias. Like, if that was the clue we were supposed to get, you wouldn't fuck up the clue by misspelling it. So no, I don't think that's what's going on here. Arimathea, as actually spelled in the Gospels, is actually a neologism. It's a faux Greek word. It means best disciple or best disciple town. And it's very convenient that what does Joseph in this story do? I think Joseph is coming from Joseph of the patriarch. I think this is an emulation, because there's another tomb story relating to Joseph that a lot of the vocabulary is drawn from. And this is Joseph in the Old Testament for the Markan story, right? And then I think you see it also in Matthew. But so they're definitely drawing on ideas from the patriarch Joseph and calling him Arimathea as the best disciple. So we're looking at an emulation of a patriarch who's being characterized as someone who comes from the region of the best discipleship. And what does he do? He does what the disciples didn't do. He stays faithful to Jesus and to the Torah law, and make sure that Jesus is properly buried. Even though he's an executed convict, the Torah law demanded that he be buried before sunset. That was the law. And Joseph is the only one who follows the law in the whole story. Even the disciples run away and don't attend to the dead as they're supposed to do. So this is all fictional narrative. And I think Arimathea is deliberately, it's a coined word. We know there's no town. People struggle to find an Arimathea. There's no such Arimathea. That we have no evidence of it. Now, like, there could have been an Arimathea. We don't have the names of all 200 towns of Judea. So there could have been an Arimathea, but we don't have any specific evidence of there being an Arimathea. And it doesn't make terribly a lot of sense I can't remember if Mark says that Joseph was a member of the council. I think he does. It would make no sense for the Jerusalem Sanhedrin to have a member from Arimathea. They would all be Jerusalemites. There would be an Arimathea Sanhedrin, perhaps, or an Arimathea council. So anyway, it's historically anachronistic. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But as literary art, as a fictional name that is supposed to carry symbolic import, the name makes perfect sense in context and helps you interpret the story in exactly the way it seems that it's intended.
Thank you, Marcus. And you know who else agrees with your interpretation on that?
Robert Price likes it.
No, you're going to be like, what? Bart Ehrman.
Oh, really?
Bart Ehrman went on record saying, yeah, I recorded. Oh, no, it wasn't me. I think
that's cool, though.
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me, right? It doesn't surprise me, because Bart Ehrman does accept a lot of the mythologization and allegorization of the Gospels. He's not a fundamentalist by any stretch, and he's comfortable with those kinds of theories.
Yeah, I just thought it was cool to point that out.
That is, yeah. I didn't know that.
Bart, he believes that this is best disciple town. He thinks that makes the most sense. Stephen Burns, thank you for the super chat, my friend. Do you think there would be Christianity without Plato, Dr. Carrier?
Yeah, because there's more Hellenistic. Well, okay. So if you're saying without Plato now, is there no Aristotle? Right. Right. So like, you take Plato out, what happens? That's a big chunk. And so the counterfactual history gets really messy here. So Hellenistic philosophy, like how dependent was it on Plato? And this is a big problem with counterfactual history, is if there was no Plato, who would have filled his role? Right. So like, you take something out, something's going to slip back in. This is the big problem with, like, you can't just take the piece out and expect it to stay vacant. So this is a big problem with history. So there would have been some other philosopher doing something. Would they have done the same thing? Would they have done a different thing? How different would it be? Would it matter? This is a really complicated question to ask. I think that the intention of the question, though, is Christianity after its first formation. So we're talking about Christianity at well post Paul, so 2nd century, 3rd century Christianity, definitely 4th century Christianity is extremely highly dependent on Platonic thinking. They definitely adopted it. They looked at all the philosophical sects. We see this explicitly in Origen. I talk about this in my books, The Scientist and the Early Roman Empire. And I have a whole section on Origen, early 3rd century Christian scholar, where even more, better one is Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, my thinner volume. Because there I talk about how Origen talks about what kind of schooling can you give Christians? Can you teach them philosophy? Because it's this pagan, it's a bunch of sinners. So do you want to teach them philosophy? And Origen looks through the schools and says which of the schools of philosophy have more affinity for what we're teaching, and Platonism is the one, right? Platonism is has the most affinity for what they can use Platonism, twist it, and construct it, and make a Platonic Christianity, which is what happened. So the Vatican Christianity, our Christianity today, is a Platonic Christianity. It's very much medieval, like all the medieval greats, Aquinas and stuff. They for all they're talking about Aristotle, they're really Platonists. And so, and because the core of what they're trying to promote was so integrated with Platonic thinking that they don't even notice that it's Platonic, right? So they're trying to make it Aristotelian, but they're really starting from a highly Platonic background. And you see that a lot in the early theologians, Augustine and so on. So I think Christianity would have been significantly different without Platonism, but I don't know that it would be different in any way that we care about. Right. So because what happened here is they had a particular way of seeing the world. They looked around for what had most affinity for it and picked it. So that if you took that away, they would just pick something else that was similarly close and reconstructed their religion on the basis of it. Right. You see what I'm saying? So it's the motivation. It's not that Plato transformed Christianity. It's Christianity already had an attitude and they picked who was closest and then allowed it to transform it a little bit more in that direction. So it would have made some changes, but I don't think it would have prevented the rise of modern Christianity.
I like to equate Christianity to a perfect survival of the fittest religion that is willing to adapt and mutate to its environment. So whatever would have been there, it'd have been the snowball picking up whatever it was to make it work. So yeah, that's really interesting. Grays 174 says, do we know if this is great, Joseph of Arimathea got his tomb back after Jesus left, since he was really just crashing on the couch for a few days?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, it's a joke, but there are actually legitimate questions involved in that, right? Because this gets down to, and this is mainstream scholarship again, have pointed out that that this could have been a temporary resting place, because it mentions that it was his tomb, right? So that means that Joseph himself expected to be buried there, and probably the rest of his family was buried there, or is going to be expecting to be buried there, if this was historically true, right? So if it was true, there is a valid question as to what happened. Is it just a temporary holding place? And was because the law required Jesus to be buried in the criminal's graveyard. It's a very specific graveyard. He couldn't be buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb. That was illegal. And so, but it was legal to temporarily hold a body over the Sabbath that way. There's actual explicit law about this. I talk about this in The Empty Tomb, the anthology by Lauder and Price, where I have the whole section on the burial of Jesus. We know a lot about burial law of that time, and there are attempts to deny that the laws that we know about applied at the time, but there's no evidence that they didn't. And so the information we have suggests that this could have just been a temporary place, and that Jesus would have ended up in the graveyard of the condemned somewhere else actually Saturday night. So by Sunday morning, that Joseph's tomb would be empty again, even though the body just got relocated. So this leads to a whole other line of thought about this. This question is meant to be a joke, but it actually touches on some actual scholarly questions.
Yeah, that's why I like this question. Good question, Grays. Thank you for that. Bobby B, I appreciate Dr. Carrier's work. How much of your experience is scholarship, books, and how much is experiential beliefs?
Well, both, right? So you apply the knowledge you get from books to your experience, and then attempt to broaden your experience. And I find books is too narrow. So you can benefit from the experience of other people. So I think a lot of my knowledge comes from just talking to other people in different walks of life, different racial and ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds. Like when you mentioned the debate that I had with Hassanein Rajabali, with it was Dan Barker and me on the one side and Rajabali and Corey on the other, before an audience of 1,000 Muslims. And we got flown into Dearborn, Michigan to do this debate. We got to spend several days. And so I had lots of opportunity to talk to hijab wearing Muslim women. Like I could have long conversations with them, ask them all kinds of questions. I got to be driven around and talk to Muslims from all over the world. Like my assigned driver was actually flown in from Syria to attend the debate. So I got to ask him about, well, what do Syrians think about Americans? And you know, so I got to ask questions and learn a lot from other people's experiences. So so if you say experiential beliefs, you should include other people that I hear, you know, by report. Obviously, it's their narrative. They're telling me, but I learn a lot from other people's experiences. I learn a lot from people in the upper class, people in the lower class, people who've been homeless, right? So I learn a lot from their experiences, and I try to integrate that knowledge with the knowledge that I get from books to produce some sort of synthesis that fits the explanation of the world. And then, of course, my own experience. I've lived a very strange life. I've done a lot of odd things. So, you know, people often are surprised to find out that I'm a military veteran. I served a year at sea. That I used to work construction. I was an electrician once. So that, you know, I've used to operate a jackhammer. Like there's this. I've had a lot of, and then went to Ivy League schools for my PhD. Right? It just doesn't match anyone's assumptions about stereotypes as to who I'm supposed to be. But yeah. I've benefited tremendously from having a huge diversity of experiences myself, as well as all the other stuff. So I guess that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you for that. William Ahrens, good to see you, my friend. Thank you so much. How can conservative Christians dedicated to the Bible use translations that do not include the Apocrypha of the KJV and in other Orthodox canons, creating a long gap in text from 400 BC to 100 AD?
How can they? Yeah, so that gets into the complexities of the bizarre belief systems they have. I'm less interested in these kinds of questions because whatever the reason is, it's some stupid reason, and right, like it's not a reason I can rationally get behind. Like their reasoning is just not rational as to why they do this. It is weird, right? Like why you cut the canon off at like roughly 400 BC. And then launch it back up again at 100. Although these Christians you're talking about would insist that it starts up again at like 40s. They think Mark was written in the 40s, et cetera, right? So, but that's a trivial difference. You still have hundreds of years, so I guess you could ask the question in a different way and say, like, what is their explanation? Like, how do they explain the fact that nothing written by Jews for hundreds of years is inspired by God? Right? Like, it's like, why nothing? Hundreds of years? Like what's your explanation for that? And it varies by sect. And even within a sect, different theologians have different answers. One answer that I've heard is that the inspiring spirit of God withdrew from Judaism until the fulfillment of all things, which is, you know, Jesus, right? So the spirit of God only comes back to inspire proper scriptures then. So that's one kind of anti-Semitic explanation that you will hear from some of the more hardcore fundamentalists. And the Christians who don't want to sound like anti-Semites will come up with some other reason. So you have to go fishing around to see what reasons there are. They're all dumb reasons that have no basis in fact, but they will come up with something. Well, I should say all the sects will come up with something. Individual members don't think about this. So if you ask them this question, they'll have no idea. Like, shit, I never thought about that. And they might make up something on the fly, or they might just admit that they don't know. But if you go looking for like theologians within specific sects who have actually addressed this question, you'll find a variety of answers.
Thank you so much for that. Appreciate that. Osvaldo, hope I'm saying that right. Thank you for the super chat. Appreciate the love and the support, my friend. Really do. David Kruder said, please see my question above. I have fat fingers. Okay, I'm going to try and hunt your question. And
well, how far up is it?
I don't know. Maybe you can help me too, because you're good at this. Are you in the thing?
I just jumped down, but you've got, what is it? I think I saw the list. There's like thousands of comments in here.
I know.
And I can't search it, can I? For the name?
I don't think so. I know if he typed it out, it'll be up here. It's just a matter of me finding it.
No,
Forgive me.
It just finds the one on your screen.
Yeah, this is why super chats and having them attached is so easy to actually do with the color and stuff.
Is there a minimum amount of money you can pay for a super chat? assume you set.
I think it's $2 or something. Maybe no.
Okay.
There's people who give like $1, just a $1 sticker.
So
or
say
whatever.
like maybe just try to revive the question by copying and pasting. If David himself can find it and just throw a cheap super chat back in.
David, I'm scrolling up. I don't know how far up this goes, and
there's so many. Like I just scrolled down and I looked at. If you look. Oh no! Okay, yeah. Before I clicked in, it said there were thousands of comments that I hadn't read. So,
oh yeah,
so,
like we almost had 700 people watching live.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have to disappoint. I don't think we can succeed at this task.
Okay, all right. Look, David, if just email me too. If for whatever reason you can't get it in, just email me, my friend. I will be sure to email it over to Carrier and get your question. And
yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I could get it answered for sure. Lawrence, what would be your best steelman argument for the Gospels being indeed written by the traditional names ascribed?
Steelman. It's hard to do. The man is pretty rusty. It's rusted out, this Steelman.
I love these questions though, because
so here's an answer I would give. So I debated this sort of. So I did this debate about the long ending of Mark being authentic, and with Jonathan Sheffield. And Jonathan Sheffield is the kind of apologist I really like because he's totally honest. Like he's not trying to game me. He's not trying to lie or deceive. Like he's actually like legitimate. These are the things he believes and why he believes them. So if you and consequently, he can't resort to tricks to make a point. So we did this debate, and you can find it on my blog. It's a multi-entry debate on the long ending of Mark. Is the long ending of Mark authentic? And this came up as a question in our discussion today, right here. But in the process of that debate, he's arguing for, softly arguing for the traditional authorship of these. These are authentic texts, and here's why they have to go back to the original authors. And that isn't the main aim that he's arguing, but it's part of the argument. And so you can see how he's arguing for it. And that is, in my opinion, the best argument that you can make for it. It's a terrible argument, but it is all you've got. Like it is the best you can make. If you want to see what that argument looks like, follow his side of that debate, and you can see my pushback against it as well. But you can see how he's trying to argue for it. And it is like I say, it's the best only because there is no better argument available. And the reason that's all that you find in there, and the reason I can recommend it is because Jonathan Sheffield is so honest. Like he's just straightforwardly, like, I like him. He looks for the evidence that is actually there and makes the best argument that's actually available, rather than like William Lane Craig, who will obfuscate and use rhetoric and try to avoid, try to sound like he's giving you a rational argument, but on analysis, he really isn't.
Thank you so much for that. John D., good to see you here, my friend. What are your thoughts about the Kalam cosmological argument?
Wow, this is a great question because that I mentioned that I'm on another show tonight. That's what we're talking about. So, so rather than answer here, I'm going to plug Hani Salim's show. You can find it.
Hani, yeah,
yeah. So,
dude, please go support him.
Yeah.
He's a great guy. Yeah,
he's a great interviewer. Does great show, and he's hitting the other half of the planet. Right. Yes. His audience is Australia, Middle East, Asia. So he's Coptic Christians. He has like both current and ex-Coptic Christians, Muslim audiences. So like that's a great show to hit because he's going to those audiences. So go to Hani Salim's show. It's I'm gonna
paste it. Don't worry, I'm sending it right now. So I just posted it right now, just so everybody sees it. This is it. Critical Faculty.
Yeah,
please
that's
go
the show. And there's so let me get the link to the actual.
Kalam Cosmological right here. I'm getting the specific link.
Here it is. Yeah, it's got the countdown probably. Yeah, live in 3 hours. There you go.
It's going down, baby.
Yeah, so that's where I'm going after this. So that's where I'll be. I have to eat lunch between now and then. But yeah, so we're going to talk all about this. I have a lot to say, especially lately. There's been some interesting, really cool developments in this of late. So that'll all come up.
So please go check that out. I'm going to be doing a live right after this. And so between the time you go to watch his live with Hani, you're going to see me and Dragons and Genesis right after this. We're talking about Enoch and Jesus. We're going to be talking about Enoch and Jesus.
This is cool. So, this is an all philosophy and religion
history
day. It's great.
Elaine Johnson. So we got to fly through these, and then I'm gonna make sure that I pay you for your time too, the extra time that you spent. If you were ever in a debate with Bart Ehrman about the historicity of Jesus, and there was a Q&A section, what would you ask him?
Wow.
On the spot.
First of all, I wouldn't, because coming from me, he would give a disingenuous answer. Like he would be disrespectful. So I would have to feed it to someone else to ask the question. And if so, the question is, what would I pick of all the questions? That's the hard one. I don't know what I would pick above them all. But in a sense, I've already answered this question, which is in my review of the Ehrman-Price debate. So Bart Ehrman and Robert Price did a debate on the historicity of Jesus, and I do a blog article where I do a breakdown of them, and I score them. And I would say, like, if you want to know what would I have picked if I were to feed a question to someone. And it's funny, I might have done this, and I don't even remember, because I was there, actually. I was physically there. I might have told someone to ask a question or two, and I don't remember what the question was. But the ones that's most likely are the ones that I thought scored the most poorly for Price and the best for Ehrman, right? So, and there are a few, like, but also where I come down on Ehrman pretty hard is not telling the truth or not being accurate. So I would try to find the one that's the most key representative example of him not giving an accurate presentation to the audience, and ask him to explain himself. And I don't mean the lying part. Like, so I've caught him outright lying to save face a few times. I wouldn't bring those up. I would stick to what was brought up in the debate for that, right? So, so something that's actually relevant to the conclusion as argued in the debate, I would only stick to that. But I would pick the one that where I think he's being the most disingenuous to the audience and misinforming them, and I would want to have him articulate and explain himself on that point, whatever that is. So if you go look at my review of the Ehrman-Price debate, you'll see several examples of this. And you might even find good questions you'd want to ask him yourself, and count this as me feeding you the questions if you ever get the chance.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Osvaldo, again, thank you so much for the super chat, my friend. I really appreciate that. Matthew Pop, Josephus records that Alexander Jannaeus, the Judean king and high priest, crucified 800 Pharisee opponents. Do historians believe this happened?
So far as I know, I haven't actually researched this, so I don't know what the scholarship actually says about it. Like, I don't know if there's anybody who doubts it. I don't know if there's questions about it, if those questions have been debated. I haven't checked, so I don't know. Mm-hmm. The impression I get from the readings I've done is that it's believed that it happened. Maybe that the number might be bogus. Like, historians are deeply suspicious of numbers. Numbers are always exaggerated, often by a factor of 10. So I wouldn't be surprised if we found a scholar who said, well, it might have been 80 and not 800. Or it might have been, a few dozen or something. But so the question would be more about, did it happen in general, not the specific number? So I think there's willingness to doubt the specific number. The reason I think this question comes up a lot is that we have very little source material for all of this. It comes from the Maccabean literature, which is like the King's literature. It's not rationalist historical writing. It's hagiographic, propagandistic writing. It's religious writing. So it's not like Josephus, who is also writing propaganda, but he's doing it by using the rationalist model that he inherited from the Greeks. So Josephus is also not. We don't trust Josephus on a lot of things, but he's at least more reliable than the Maccabean literature. And when we get to the Maccabean stuff in Josephus, it doesn't appear that he has any source material other than the Maccabean literature, which is problematic for us. So, so there are legitimate foundations for wanting to be skeptical, or at least approach it with a position of skepticism. But I think you need more than that to doubt a historical event. And this is a point I make if you look at my article on Hannibal or Jesus from Outer Space, which I use the same material in Jesus from Outer Space, where I talk about a Hannibal and also Spartacus, where I go into why there's an a priori reason to be skeptical of the historicity of Jesus that does not apply to mundane political events like this one that's being referenced here. So the historicity of Jesus already starts low in a way an event like this does not. And that's because of the precedence of the way historians and writers choose to make up things, what they tend to most often make up, what they tend least often to make up, based on precedents like that. So I think there's I don't think we should be as skeptical of this as we can be of Jesus. And you notice that I've already given a 1 in 3 chance for Jesus. So that puts pretty good, even better odds on this being historical, right? Using the same methods, even with the same evidence. So anyway, so I would warrant caution, but I understand the reason to be skeptical.
Thank you so much. Doc Pleroma. Historically, could Christian baptism or sacramentum to a Lord be seen as a rite of Roman and Jewish resistance in the absence of state protection rather than repentance for the coming kingdom?
No. No, not at all. The rite is almost identical to the rite that we find in every other mystery cult. And so mystery cults were already well established as fictive kinship brotherhoods. So everybody's becomes a family. So you become baptized into the fate of the Savior, and literally often, like Apuleius says of in Osiris cult, it's literally you're being baptized in the death and resurrection of Osiris, and therefore you're under the protection of that God. So in the afterlife, you get a favorable afterlife, and which is exactly what the Christian baptism is. So the only twist they add is that they make it an adoption ritual, so that you become the son of God. You're the adopted son of God. But that's a Jewish concept. Of the basically the spiritual adoption notion comes from Jewish angelology. So it's there's nothing a threat to the empire about that. That was ubiquitous. Like everybody had baptisms into these savior cults, like all the way up to the emperor, right? So like there was nothing politically subversive about this at all. And the Roman state never took it as subversive. The last time they took it as subversive was centuries before the Roman Empire even existed, right? So you go all the way back to the early Republic. There was hostility to these mystery cults with their fictive brotherhood. They thought as traitorous or as a threat, but that they completely abandoned that view and completely did a 180 on it, and are completely supportive, even building temples to these cults. Like they supported these cults in the Roman Empire. So it's not a subversive element, and there's no evidence of the particular interpretation that's being asked about here. The interpretation is all on the side of the mystery cult interpretation that we see.
Thank you so much. Osvaldo, thank you for the super chat. In the bitter water story, how does it really relate to abortion, since it does not so much as spell it out, or is it strictly related to infidelity?
I assume they're asking about the ritual.
Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, because there's another bitter water story that has nothing to do with abortion in the Bible. But anyway, there's some sort of ritual where a husband accuses his wife of adultery, and the priest can assemble some of that blood ashes from the altar and mix a potion, have her drink it. And the Hebrew is very vague, so there's a lot of scholarly debate over what is supposed to happen. If nothing happens, then she's innocent, and that's that. But if something happens, like she either dies or miscarries, so there's like some interpretations of the Hebrew imply miscarriage. If she miscarries, which would be an abortion, right, caused by the potion. So there's complexities here as to what does the Hebrew even say that there's a debate in the field about this, and then if it does say that, is that a God-sanctioned abortion, basically? Which yes, it would be if that was the case. So it's not. Yeah, I think maybe that's what they're asking is what is really going on there. The problem is the language is so obscure and ancient that it's hard for scholars to even agree on what's being described as happening. And if it is a miscarriage, this is a very primitive ritual. It's very similar to other rituals that we know from anthropology of religion, where this is actually a con act. So the priest will have pre-decided whether she's guilty or innocent, and will decide what to actually give her to produce predictable effects based on his judgment. And then this gets perceived as the judgment of God, right? Because clearly God must have caused the difference of result. So this is the kind of, there's this kind of like manipulation of audiences is common in the history of religions. Like the anthropology of religion is full of discussions of how these kinds of acts are used to sort of manipulate audiences, and so this reads exactly like one of those. So it was probably like that. So it doesn't really even matter what the result would be. It matters more that this is a game being played on the audiences, and it's really the judgment of the priest who's deciding whether she's guilty or innocent on whatever basis. Anyway, so that's that side of it. But that ritual looks like very primitive. So it looks like it looked more primitive than most of like Deuteronomy and the context of Jewish law. So it probably goes back really far. So it probably predates any opposition to abortion. And we don't actually see any opposition to abortion in the Old Testament. I know that there's a lot of play up of the assault law. There's this, if you punch a woman and cause her to miscarry, and there's disagreement again about the language as to what does it say, is early trimester abortion legal according to this text, or it's just a property crime because you prevented the heir, so you have to pay for the kid that they don't get. So it's not murder, but it also says if it comes out a certain way, then it is murder. And so there's a question of how you interpret that. I have an article on my blog where I go into this and deal with the ongoing debate in the field today about it, about how abortion is legal in the Old Testament, but homosexuality is definitely illegal in the Old Testament. You can go to my blog and search homosexuality and abortion, and then you'll find my article, and I'll go into it. But there's legitimate ways to look at this. I think what it's actually saying is that a late trimester abortion is murder, early trimester abortion is property crime, and property crime against the father. So according to Jewish law, a mother in like first trimester could go get an abortion, but she'd have to pay 50 shekels to the father. That's how the law reads.
Wow.
Right. So, and there's more on this, interestingly, in the Roe v. Wade decision. So if you go, actually, people talk about Roe v. Wade, but people rarely read it. Go read the Supreme Court. It's a long ruling. They go into the history of abortion in detail through multiple religions, Judaism and so on, and talk about rabbinical attitudes and all kinds of stuff. There's a ton of interesting stuff in there about the history of abortion, and it does not line up with what fundamentalists want you to think is the history of abortion.
If I may, one little funny note as we go on, because I want to move on to these next ones here. There's a rabbi wrote in the Talmud that the husband comes to him and says, listen, she didn't have blood on the night we were supposed to do the do. And, what do we do? I think she's cheated on me, or she did some things she shouldn't have done, fornicated. And rabbi takes her and he sets her on this barrel of wine. And he says, if I smell the wine through her breath, okay, that meant her hymen was really intact. Like some weird, like old, outdated.
It's bullshit. Total bullshit.
Yeah, but he made the ruling. It's really funny, though. I think,
that's a good example of a confidence game, because if he tells her this, the actual psychological intention is to make her nervous, and so it's kind of like a primitive lie detector test. The assumption is that, like, if she starts to sweat, if she starts to be nervous, then I assume she's lying, which is a bad assumption. We know using this technique for lie detection is terribly unreliable. But it's been believed to be reliable. It's still believed to be reliable. Lie detector tests are still based on it. So when people say, well, you should take a polygraph, and it's like, that's the same crap method as having her sit on a barrel. It just has wires involved. That's really the only thing that's changed. It's the same crap method, but it shows you, like, these confidence games, these tricks are inherent in religion throughout history.
Nikolai, thank you for the super chat. Is God's omniscience different from the idea of deterministic universe in terms of free will?
That's a big debate in theology, and I find theology boring. As theologians debate this, right? As to what extent is determinism actually what God wants, or to what extent has he... And also this idea of middle knowledge, right? So omniscience. So if God knows everything, then isn't everything already fixed, right? Like how can he know the decision you're making in the future if you have free will, right? That should be impossible. And so one of the solutions to this is middle knowledge, the idea that God knows every possible future. There's a lot of weird legerdemain.
I think the question he's trying to get at is the idea of, like, say, an atheistic deterministic universe, whereas there's like and of course there's the idea.
Well, I think he says omniscience, not omnipotence.
Okay.
Omniscience, I'm sure he's asking, is there a contradiction between saying God is omniscient and we have free will, right? Because there is an obvious, like, if you take their version of free will, I'm compatibilist, so I don't think free will is incompatible with determinism anyway. So it's completely moot question for me. It only matters to theologians who bank so much on libertarian free will and contra-causal free will as a concept. I think that's an incoherent concept. It isn't true. That's not what free will is. Right. So the debate is completely moot. It's a waste of time. But within their debate between each other, these theologians, they're the ones who want free will to be contra-causal, but also want God to be omniscient, and this creates a problem.
Yeah.
And they solve this problem with one of the solutions to this problem is the invention of middle knowledge. And so if you Google middle knowledge, you'll find all kinds of like claptrap about this. And so
just go to William Lane Craig and you'll find it.
Yeah,
He's
so big on this. Yeah, it's an important subject for him.
Yeah. Myth Wisdom Podcast. Thank you for the super chat. Very close to mine. The story of Jesus cursing the fig tree makes sense when you know the fig tree is a type of goddess. Jesus reps Father God, not Mother God.
Yeah, that's not what's going on in that story. The fig tree is the Jewish temple cult. And the Hamilton Kelly did an article on this. I cite him and use his work in, I should say them. I actually don't know if it's he or she. It doesn't matter. But I use their work on this on the Historicity of Jesus when I analyze this in chapter 10, when I go into the section on Mark, and I do the fig tree episode. And it's very clear, like you can break it down. The literary structure of this is very elegant. The fig tree is the Jewish temple cult. And this is a story about why God allowed the destruction, not only the destruction of his own temple and the end of the cult, but allowed it to be destroyed by heathens even. So, and the message is, because the story starts before the clearing of the temple and ends after the clearing of the temple, and this wrapping, this sandwiching of stories is a literary technique. So the one story that's wrapping around the other, these are commenting on each other. So this is how you know these two stories are connected. And if you want to understand both of them, you have to understand how each one is a commentary on the other, right? So that's how you know this is about the Jewish temple cult. And the answer is that, like, what does Jesus say? He says, it is no longer, or the story is, it's no longer the season for figs, and God is going to curse it and wither it because its time is done. And so that's what this is about. It's why did God destroy the temple? Its time is done. It no longer is bearing fruit, and it's not the season for it anymore. So we're going to move on. And then immediately after, Jesus talks about how it's all about prayer and stuff now, and not the temple cult. Why you don't need the temple cult. So anyway, that's what that's really about. It has no connection to goddess worship.
Thank you so much. Cade Welly says, thank you both for doing this on Saturday. Due to work, I'm rarely able to see these interviews live. I don't have a question, just sending love. Again, thank you. Cade, good to see you here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I'm usually most available on weekends, so it works out for me too. And not because I have a day job. It's weird. I have a strange life. But yeah, this is Friday, Saturday, Sunday are my most accessible days now.
Thank you. I've been getting a lot of comments about my hair lately. Thank you, Friendly Muslim. Mr. Green Gold, thank you for the super chat. What's your take on the belief that Christianity introduced in India by Thomas in 52 AD? Can it prove historical Jesus?
It can't do that because it's a late, ridiculous legend that has no support in any reliable evidence. So we can't even prove that it happened. And any of the evidence that we have for it is through and through ridiculous. Like it's like hagiographically, anachronistically unbelievable. So it didn't even have sources, or if it did, it's completely clouded them in bullshit that they piled on top of it. So we don't know. We really can't reconstruct the history of Christianity in India. It's entirely possible that Christianity made it to India. Maybe 52 AD is a little early. It's possible, but it would be more likely that it would be there by the end of the 1st century rather than so early. Because it got all the way to China by at least 700 AD, right? So the Nestorians were preaching Christianity in China. And that's 700 years roughly to get from the Middle East across the Silk Road to China. That's a long time. We know that route can be done in a year or two because we have emissaries. We have documentation of emissaries of China that they sent people back to Rome, the Roman Empire, to report back to China about the Roman Empire. And this was done in the Han Dynasty. So we know the route was just a matter of years. Like it wasn't to get all the way. And so you could have a missionary who's just committed to skipping all the towns in between and going all the way as far as it went. That's plausible, although usually a missionary can't pass up an opportunity to evangelize. So as soon as they start getting on the road, they're going to stop and they're going to get distracted at this little town evangelize. And they're going to go and they're going to go and they're going to die before they get, one province away, right? So you know what I mean? So it's possible. It's possible that there was Christianity in India in the 1st century. We have no reliable evidence of that being the case.
Thank you. Vesper says, how do you count? And thank you, Vesper. How do you count for Jesus' attestation from less conventional sources like Mandeism, Talmud, Indian, Himalayan evidence, mostly during the lost years? This is kind of in the vein of the same.
It's all too late, right? These are all made up legends that appear hundreds, in some cases, 1,000 or more years later. They're not usable. They have no reliable, traceable source back to antiquity. So you just can't use random legends that come up hundreds of years later. The fact that these legends don't exist in any earlier sources is kind of already demonstration that they're made up. So that's at worst, and at best, we can't say that they aren't made up, and so they aren't usable.
Thank you so much. Onyx Dragon X7 says, "Hey Richard, how does your moral philosophy deal with the is-ought problem? Do you have a particular name for your moral philosophy?"
Yeah, I hate names because people will then misdefine it and then misuse the name. So a goal theory is what I call it when I need a name for it. It is a species of desire utilitarianism. And I emphasize species of because people will misdefine desire utilitarianism and then assume that I endorse everything that every desire utilitarian has said. That's not the case. But what desire utilitarians say is roughly what I'm saying, but I think you can get even more specific than they do. But anyway, so a species of desire utilitarianism and the is-ought problem. So I actually have a whole chapter on this. That's actually one of my peer-reviewed, heavily peer-reviewed works in philosophy, which is in The End of Christianity by, it's another one of the Loftus volumes. Let's see if I can get it.
Yeah, is that on Amazon as well?
Oh, of course, yeah. The End of Christianity. It's another anthology with lots of good authors contributing on many different topics. And I have two in there. Yeah, I have one on the design argument and one on the moral argument. And in there, I do a full analysis of the is-ought problem, going into Hume and Kant and in the actual dialectical construction of the concept. So if you really want to dive into that, that's where that is. If I'm trying to think of the shortest way to explain it, is that the word ought in all imperative language, it's not, ought isn't the only form, and in all languages too, there's different ways of phrasing the same kind of imperative language. Imperative language is always a subjunctive statement of what someone would do if they were acting fully rationally and informed. So you ought to do X means you would do X if you were fully rational and informed when deciding what to do. So it is actually a future subjunctive, and as such has it has straightforward truth values. So there really is no is-ought dichotomy. Ought does reduce to an is. It just reduces to a very particular kind of is that you have to articulate.
Thank you. Constellation Pegasus, thank you, my friend. Just bought both Carrier books on eBay, mentioned here today, and add it to the list of books I'm already behind on reading. I've got a lot of reading.
I'm in the same boat. I've got a couple of books here. I've got the new one by Ibn Waraq I want to get to, and I'm supposed to review Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, and I just haven't found time to get into that either. It's sitting here on my desk. I know I'm sympathized. There's so many books I want to read, and I just don't have time.
Thank you for that. Pet Mark, not all epic and legendary literature is about characters that did not exist. The poem of the Cid about a Spanish medieval knight is an example.
Yeah, I can't speak to that one because that's outside my field. I don't know the story on that one. But we have the Alexander romances, for instance, which were written in his own when he was, if not when he was still alive, shortly after his death, the first Alexander romances. And these are ridiculous stories, obviously mythical, about Alexander the Great. So yeah, we know mythical stuff can be written about historical people. Happens a lot. So the only question is, how typical is that? So when you see a ridiculous mythical narrative, how often in history, particularly the relevant history, so the ancient world, so say the Greco-Roman period, how often are those historical people? That's the only question you need to answer. It's like, is it typically historical people, or is it typically not historical people, or is it 50-50? And that's an empirical question. You have to go and look at comparable cases and see how many of these cases did the person exist, and how many it's not likely that they did. And that's what I do. So I do that on the Historicity of Jesus. I have a whole chapter on how we do this empirically to figure it out. What is the prior probability? And even that just gets you the prior probability. It does not get you the posterior probability, the actual probability you want, because as the case of Alexander the Great, like having it, even if it's the case that stories like that typically indicate a non-existent person, you could have tons of evidence that he's the exception, right? As we do. We have tons of evidence that Alexander the Great existed. So that hugely overwhelms the prior and establishes that he exists. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the probability significantly that there were legendary mythologies written about Alexander the Great. It doesn't make him not exist. The evidence is overwhelming in the other direction when you add it all up.
Thank you.
And that's what we would want to be the case for Jesus, and it just isn't.
Sorry. Myth Wisdom Podcast. Who was the patriarch of the Roman religion in the 1st century AD? What was the role of Serapis in 1st century AD Roman religion?
Patriarch. They didn't really have that, right? So patriarchs, if you think in the Jewish model, the patriarchs are the founders of their religion, and it's very important to name and know the founders of your religion and know the stories about them.
Maybe Romulus would be the example of their patriarch, I guess.
Well, sort of. I guess you would include him, right? He would be, if you're trying to find something loosely analogous,
right?
He would be in there. But the Roman religion is hugely diverse and has a variety of different origin moments, because there's not just the Romulus myth, but there's also the dawn of Romulus religion, which is hundreds of years later, where Quirinus gets reinterpreted as this new Romulus thing, and then there's a new introduction. There's even reference to like discovering, just like in the Old Testament, there's a reference to discovering lost ancient texts that reveal this new or this old religion that's actually really a new religion they just made up, but they're trying to sell it as these ancient texts that were buried all this time, that relate to the Romulus cult. So like, it's like you could talk about like the patriarchs that found those guys who claimed to find the ancient documents, or the patriarchs, the non-existent people like Romulus. Right. And then there's a ton of religions, right? So Rome is just plastered with religions. So it's not like Romulus cult was the Roman religion. No, there's like a million of these religions. The Capitoline triad doesn't even include Romulus, right? So it's like he's not even the top three of their central god, their central pantheon. But anyway, so the analogies don't really work between Judaism, because Judaism is a henotheistic religion. It's very focused on one tradition that you have to adhere to, and for that your patriarchy matters, right? So you kind of have to invent these patriarchs to found their claim that there's only one way to do things, whereas the Romans didn't believe there was only one way to do things. They agreed there's lots of ways to do things, and so they didn't need a patriarchy for their religion. In that sense.
What about Serapis in the first?
Separate question. Serapis. So Serapis means Osiris and Apis, is the merger of these two gods. And so when the Greeks came in, I think it's the Ptolemies. When the Ptolemies took over after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, the Ptolemies are the descendants of the Greek general Ptolemy who served under Alexander, Macedonian, doesn't matter. By the time we're talking, it's Greek. And so the Greeks who were running Egypt decided they needed a version of Asclepius. So in Greece, in Macedonia, you had Asclepius, who was the god of healing, had huge temples of healing. They're basically the early versions of hospitals. And so this big, important healing god. And Egypt didn't really have one of those. You could pray to a variety of different gods for healing in a variety of different ways. There was no concentrated god of healing, right? And the Greeks wanted one. So they kind of merged the two gods, Osiris and Apis, and created Serapis, and he became the healing god. And all his iconography shows that he's based on Asclepius. So he's basically a syncretism of Egyptian religion. They took Osiris and Apis cult and then syncretized it, merged it with Asclepius cult, and created a new religion, which is Serapis cult. When that began, there's debate. So like legend is it was in the Ptolemies before the 1st century AD. I haven't really looked into like how the evidence holds up as to when we can precisely date it. There's a lot of archaeology. We have statues and inscriptions and things. So there's a lot to work with. It's just not something I've looked into yet.
Thank you so much. T Mark, thank you for that. T Marked, sorry. I appreciate the super chat, my friend. We should be, man. I'm trying.
I know we're not going to get them all.
Heart Sphere. What do you think about the swoon theory? And could you get a bit into parallels between Jesus and Jesus Ben Ananias? Love your stuff. Thank you so much.
Wow, those are two very different questions. They're not even related. Okay.
So be mindful, if you're adding a super chat question, we may not get to it. I'll try and screenshot them and send all these screenshots to Dr. Carrier in an email. Maybe we just do a follow-up episode and we chip away at those at some point or something. I don't know.
Robert Price did a really good chapter on the whole category. Swoon theory is a species of what's called rationalization theory. So this was big in the 19th century, the idea that they're going to explain miracles by rationalizing them rather than just admitting they're made up. So like when Moses didn't part the Red Sea, but there was a wind that, so like you're trying to say like, oh, it really happened, but it was a natural explanation. When we know that they just made it up, it didn't happen at all. So rationalization was popular. Swoon theory is an example of this, and I think it first arises in the 19th century. I'm not sure, early 20th for sure, but which is maybe the death and resurrection really did happen, but has a rational explanation. And so swoon theory is one, and there's actually arguments to be made for it. There's clues in the text that actually support it, which is interesting. The best case for it, I'm trying to think of Price did a good chapter on this. I'm trying to figure out where he did that. Where is that chapter? Yes, here it is. So it's also in The End of Christianity. So the book that I mentioned earlier, The End of Christianity, Robert Price has a chapter called Explaining the Resurrection Without Recourse to Miracle. And the whole chapter is about rationalization hypotheses, including the swoon theory and others, right? So, and it's a good chapter because he's right about, like, when he talks about the evidence that he's presenting for these theories, that evidence is real, like it's actually there, and that you can make these cases.
Right.
So it's worth looking into. Like that's the best one that I've seen. I don't advocate it anywhere because I think in the hierarchy of probabilities it's really low, but it's not impossible. And I would obviously admit that its probability is probably millions of times still higher than supernatural resurrection, right? So even if it's thousands of times less than the most likely explanation, it's still millions of times more likely than an actual resurrection occurred. And of course, I would say that even if aliens came down and, Klaatu Verata Niktoed him. So like even that is millions of times more likely than supernatural explanation. And that's millions of times less likely than swoon theory. So so the order of probabilities here gets pretty steep once you get down to the doldrums of these.
What about the second part? Jesus.
Well, so yeah, that's a long thing. We could do a whole half a show on that, I think. But so other scholars have done this. So that's where I found out about it. Is I actually read the literature, and there's multiple independent discoveries of this matchup, where Mark, his crucifixion narrative, in 20 points, all in the same order, emulates the crucifixion, the death narrative of Jesus ben Ananias. And ben Ananias was this crazy prophet who has a similar storyline towards the end as Jesus does. He's not crucified; he gets killed by an artillery stone on the walls of Jerusalem. But there's a lot of similarities. Otherwise, like once you think like killed by the Romans is your analogy, not specific means of killing. Once you think in terms of those, loose analogs, there's a 20-point lineup to the extent that it's highly unlikely to be by coincidence. So Mark is either using the same story as a model as Josephus, or he's using Josephus specifically as his model. I think that's more likely. So I think Mark is using the Jewish War, because this is in the Jewish War, not the Antiquities. He's using the Jewish War as his model, and so this fits Mark's date as late 70s, right? So that all lines up. I think that's entirely plausible. But people who want to know more about that, you can look up Jesus ben Ananias in the index of my book on the historicity of Jesus. I discuss all the 20 points of comparison. I cite the scholarship and so on.
Thank you. Dr. Carrier, do you feel comfortable answering this question?
Sure, yeah.
How has your life been as a polyamorous man? Do you have any advice for anyone considering the lifestyle?
Yeah, for people who don't know, I'm polyamorous, so I don't believe in monogamy as a thing. So it's ethical non-monogamy, so honest and open. Everybody's doing it. And my best advice would be, there are some good books. So there's a variety, like More Than Two is kind of the Bible of polyamory, but it's really thick, so it might be a tough read. There are shorter manuals. I would say look for the books on polyamory that were written in the last 15 years. So for example, people will recommend The Ethical Slut, and that's still a good book, but it's kind of outdated in a lot of ways. And so there are others. There have been a few recently that I think are fairly decent. Do I have one here? Well, I don't, I've got this. I haven't read this one. This is actually one on the list of books I want to read. The Smart Girl's Guide to Polyamory. And obviously, by the title, it's, ostensibly written for women. I find those books are often super helpful for guys. So I would recommend reading it anyway. But I do this also with Math Doesn't Suck by Danica McKellar. If people want to learn 6th grade math, which is all you need to do Bayesian epistemology, by the way, is 6th grade math is all you need. Her book, Math Doesn't Suck, is great. And not only does it teach you in a very colloquial, easy way, all the things that you forgot about 6th grade math, but it also teaches you about girls. So it's great to give to like boys in 6th grade. So it's worth reading, even though it's supposedly meant for girls. It's actually very educational for both genders. So this also, so I know I've skimmed this enough to know that it's a decent introduction, and even though it is skewed towards the women in the audience, it's still useful for a guy to read. So it's a good place to start with one of those books, a shorter one. If you really want the Bible, like more than 2 is like the most extensive treatment of it. So I start with a book, but then start meeting people and talking to them who actually do it. Like hang out with some polyamorous folk and get their perspective and diversify. So this is the same thing I would recommend for people who you want to understand race relations, you want to understand gender relations. Don't go talk to one woman or one black guy. Like talk to many from many different perspectives so you get a diverse point of view, because there are people who are polyamorous who are, in my opinion, are doing it wrong. And so you might get bad advice if you pick the wrong polyamorous group to hang out with. So you need to get a diversity. So meet a variety of different polyamorous folk and ask them questions and hang out with them and see, especially hang out with them like with their polycules, so that you see what a relationship, non-monogamous relationship, works like when you're all, not all of you, but maybe at least some of you are hanging out together, right? So it's not just, you don't silo each other. Like you don't like only date one person and no one else meets them. That's not how it works. At least that's not how it should work. But that would be my advice. So that, like, look for some books, look for something recent and short to start with, and then just start trying to meet people. And I realize it can be hard. So in the real world, depends on where you are geographically. Like Chicago is great for polyamory. LA is terrible for polyamory. And then if you're like in Searcy, Arkansas, it's like the worst for polyamory. So it depends. So you might have to rely on internet, find internet communities that you can engage with in some way. In personal interaction with people who are willing to do it. Like they're not obligated to like educate you. So you got to find people who are excited by the opportunity to educate you. And those are the folks you want to talk to. But yeah, getting some advice about that. And then the last advice I'd say is like, this is something that people will always say, who are experienced at poly, is like, you got to figure out your own shit before you be polyamorous. Like you've got to sort yourself out. Right. So you got to like figure out what is it that you really want out of relationships and why. And if you have problems with relationships, like if you're doing relationships wrong in general, polyamory is not going to help you. Like you need to solve those problems and sort yourself out as a person before you go successfully polyamorying around the world. But I think people should do that anyway, even if you're not doing polyamory. There's a lot of like ways that you can improve the way you do relationships, even if you're monogamous. And there's this stuff online that you can go exploring and use your critical thinking skills to see which advice is good and which is not online about relationship stuff and about yourself. Self-knowledge is really important, I think, for it.
Thank you. David T., the author of Hebrews, writing before AD 70, seemed to anticipate the typical ending soon, Hebrews 8:13, 9:8. Paul seems to think the same thing, 2 Corinthians 3:11. Why did they anticipate this?
No, actually, Hebrews doesn't really anticipate it ending. Hebrews argues that it has become obsolete, right? So Hebrews doesn't say like the Romans are going to come and destroy the temple. Like it doesn't say that. What it says is God no longer cares about it. And so what Hebrews is saying is that, well, Jesus' sacrifice does what the temple already does. So you don't need the temple. So the Hebrews' entire argument assumes the temple cult is still running, which is why I think it's pretty conclusively it had to have been written in the 60s, because it's after Paul, because it doesn't seem to be contemporaneous with Paul, but it's before the Jewish War. So that leaves the early 60s. It's the only time it could have been written. And what they're trying to argue is these people who want to go back to relying on the Jewish temple cult and arguing that they don't have to because that's obsolete now because Jesus. And so that's the argument, which means the temple cult was still up and running when that was going on. And so that is not a prediction that the temple is going to be ending. It's basically outright saying that it is obsolete already, even when it's already standing. And that's a different kind of thing.
And Paul said the same thing is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Paul is saying the exact same stuff as this. And Hebrews is very much pushing a Pauline epistemology and theology. Yeah.
Thank you, Ty Bogey. What are your thoughts on Jesus being the son of a Roman soldier? A hypothesis that James Tabor shares.
Oh, okay.
Too, so, yeah.
I didn't know Tabor adopted that specific. I know Tabor's big on the family of Jesus.
He's not like dogmatic about this.
All right.
He does think it's a plausible possibility. Yeah, he does think it's possible.
I always worry about that because that's what the Nazis thought too. So that is actually a Nazi belief.
Wow.
Yeah, positive Christianity, the Aryan Christ theory is the Nazis' own sect of Christianity.
I could see why they would want to.
Of course, the idea was invented as a polemic, a Jewish polemic against Christians. We have multiple attestations of it as a polemic in the 2nd century. So Celsus mentions it. I can't remember.
There's even Jewish writings. I think that's a Sefta.
It shows up in the and in the Talmud. Yeah, it shows up in rabbinical writings. So it definitely was a thing going around. And the idea and the Jewish one was based on a pun. So they made the joke that she wasn't a Parthenos, she wasn't a virgin. She was stooped by a Pantheros, right? Because it's like very similar spelling. Pantheros was a common nickname, kind of like a Rocky or whatever. It means panther. You're for a Roman soldier. So I am Panther. Like it was a common kind of dumb name that they would sort of like make them sound masculine and cool. And so it's kind of double mockery, right? Like it's mocking Romans, it's mocking Christian teachings, it's mocking Mary the Virgin. No nonsense.
Everybody gets
right. So it was originally intended as a joke, like it's a joke, right? But by the time it gets up to the Nazis, you see Rosenberg and various other Nazi thinkers, they start pushing this idea. Actually, this is great because we like this because this means we can say Christianity is anti-Jewish and is really because Jesus was really an Aryan and he was really sticking it to the Jews, like all his clearing of the temple and talking about Jewish avarice and stuff, like all this stuff about money and everything is being read through the filter of Jesus as an anti-Semite, just like us. He agreed the Jews are terrible. Look what Jesus says all the time. And so that's the Nazi version of this. So whenever I hear people like saying, "Oh yeah, that's actually plausible," I'm like, historical context, not good.
Yeah, not good at all. But thank you for that. Thank you, Ty Bogey. I know there's so many more, man. Just real quick. I mean, we're not going to get all of them. I get it, Carrie. I got to let you go.
Actually, I do got to go. I got to eat.
Yeah. Another bump to keep Carrie on. We're finally catching up to this, but look, we've gone 3 hours.
$20, man.
Yeah, okay. I know. And one more, just asteroid.
All right. We'll do one
Father,
more.
why have you forsaken me? I'm going to screenshot these super chats and try to send them to you in an email and see if that's possible. There's something there, but why have you forsaken me? Jesus went willingly to crucifixion, yet felt abandoned, like he thought he would be saved. This always puzzled me, part of why I became an atheist. Thoughts?
So this is literary art, right? First of all, that's a line from scripture. It comes from the crucifixion. So there's or at least an execution narrative. So there's the Psalms. So Psalms 22, 23, and 24. They number differently in different texts, but they're always in the same sequence. Psalm 22 is the execution narrative, which there's tons of references to it in the crucifixion narrative of Jesus, the casting lots for the clothes, the people condemning you from below, and like all of this stuff is in there, including, why have you forsaken me, which I think is the opening line or close to, of this. Now, Psalm 23, you will recognize as the funeral psalm, the shadow of the valley of death psalm, right? So this is the psalm about a journey of the dead, right? And then the Psalm 24 is a psalm of exaltation, of ascension through the gates of heaven. So here we have crucifixion, burial, and resurrection. So the Christians, Mark especially, used this 3-psalm pattern, and Mark 16 starts with the first line of Psalm 24. Right. So when he's talking about the resurrection, he's cluing you in. Hey, Psalm 24, I've already done Psalm 23 with the burial. Psalm 22, you got all the links in there. Like, catch up, right? It's what Mark is doing here. So he's actually using these, and this is another example of Pesher logic, of taking these scriptures and putting them in here. into a new narrative and into a new sequence of events, and to mean a different thing. And so why? Like, why would Mark want this line, the thing? And this is Pauline. This actually comes from Paul. So Paul says in Philippians, Paul says that Jesus could have chosen to be equal to God, but he, unlike Satan, which is the subtext here, he did not attempt to equate himself to God. He actually humbled himself and gave up all, even like humbled himself to the status of a slave, which we know from the narrative Jesus wasn't a slave. So what does that mean? It means he became a slave to the elements. He surrendered all his supernatural powers and to the lowest possible state, even unto death. This is what Paul says. So Jesus willingly, voluntarily humbled himself as far down as you could possibly go, so that his sacrifice would be ultimately meaningful and cleanse the world of sin, and then he could ascend to heaven. So that was the whole, and be resurrected, etc. So Mark is representing this here, this complete forsakenness concept, is this idea that Jesus has gone to the depths of humility as far as he could possibly go, and thus representing the Philippians hymn, essentially. And then, of course, he's going to be raised to glory, right? He's going to come back, and so he has to get to the bottom. He has to bottom out. What is the line? And for people who have drug addictions, like, you have to
rock bottom.
Right? Rock bottom. Jesus had to hit rock bottom before he could ascend to glory, and that's what this represents. It's like the abandonment by God is the most abandoned you could be, right? So that is the ultimate humble status. So that's really just a literary way to represent what Paul is conceptually talking about. That Jesus literally abandoned. All
this
that
message grabs so many people, because people experience such a pain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why it's religions are always crafted, especially successful ones. Darwinian logic tells you they've clearly hit on right nerves. That's why they're successful. So they come up with messages that resonate with people.
Well, just so everybody knows, please go get on his blog, check out Dr. Richard Carrier's blog. His books are on Amazon. Richard Carrier, why did it say Richard Scary? What the heck? I don't know. That was an accident. I don't know how, but they found you anyway.
It was a typo correction when you did it. That happens.
I know, totally. Join the Patreon,
Scary, which makes even less sense. But all right, yeah.
Please consider joining my Patreon. I've got more videos coming soon. The Epic of all sorts of fun. I mean, literally go all the way down. Then you hit and load more. And there's probably, I'd say 60, 70 videos with you and Dr. Dennis McDonald that I have not made public. That you and Dennis go and hash some things out, etc.
I know, yeah. There's a lot of cool stuff coming down the pipe. I know.
Yes. So please go check that out. Everybody who super chatted, like Dennis has said, in 2011, my master's thesis argued the Four Horsemen would alter academia. Richard Carrier, his geekness. Dr. Price, David Fitzgerald, and Derek et al. Proved my contention. Thank you, Dennis. Look, I'll screenshot the rest of these super chats, and then I'll just send them to you. And if there's any questions and you have time to chip away, if not, our next live.
Yeah, if there's enough of them. Oh yeah, next live, right?
We can do this again.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah,
thank you so much. Yeah, let me close this out here. Ladies and gentlemen, please go help support Dr. Carrier, get the works, join his blog. You can take classes, courses, the books, et cetera, et cetera. The knowledge that this man has is, I'd say he knows more than the Son of Man. He probably knows the day or hour. And so you might want to take him seriously and go consider what he has to say. I really appreciate your time, Dr. Carrier. Thank you.
Yeah, always love being on. It's been great. Good questions.
Never forget.
Too. Everybody's asking good stuff.
Oh, brilliant, brilliant minds. And never forget, we are MythVision.
Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.